Hello everybody, my name is Mitchell Pearson here at Pragmatic Works. Welcome to another awesome event. Today we're going to be taking a look at Azure Synapse Analytics, so stay tuned. All right, so welcome back. We're going to be taking a look at Azure Synapse Analytics. There has been a lot of interest in this topic. We've been very busy around this year, and so we thought, hey, we'll do an event around this topic. A little bit about myself before we jump in. I am the training manager here at Pragmatic Works. I've been doing consulting and training for Pragmatic Works for a little bit over 9 years now. I started my career obviously doing consulting, and then over the last 4 years, I've been doing a lot of training specifically. I've had an opportunity to author a few different books that are on Power BI, on the Power Platform, as well as on SQL Server when 2019 came out. I do blog at mitchellpearson.com, but as most of you probably know, a lot of the interactivity and our kind of community involvement now involves YouTube. So we do a lot of recorded videos on YouTube. We've done a ton of these Learn with the Nerd events that are 3 hours long. So definitely go back and check those out. I have a wife and 3 kids right here in Fleming Island. It's right outside of Jacksonville, Florida on the East Coast. I do enjoy playing tabletop games. That has not been something we've been able to do a lot recently, as you might expect. And then a couple of channels I put down here at the bottom. These are channels for specifically, I would encourage you to go take a look at Pragmatic Works' YouTube channel, because if we're doing Synapse Analytics today, but it's very closely tied to another event I did, which was Azure Data Services. 3 hours talking about Azure, the data platform specifically. And today we're not really going to get that high of an overview. We're going to be jumping in to ASA. We're going to be doing demos, and we're going to be having fun with that. All right. So, and then some pictures, of course, of some board games. So real quick, let's talk about the agenda. What should you expect over the next 3 hours that we spend together? First of all, we're going to be taking a look at what is Azure Synapse Analytics, or I call it ASA. What is ASA? We're going to take a look at the Data Lake store. That's part of it. SQL pools, dedicated and serverless, how we can leverage both of those within the Azure Synapse Analytics environment. We're going to take a look at, of course, pipelines and data flows. How do we do ETL? That's going to be cool. We're going to look at notebooks, right? And then we're also going to look at Power BI for Synapse. And then Matt, my trusty helper, is letting me know that I am not sharing my PowerPoint. So thank you, Matt, for that. There's the slide again for everybody. That's going to be the agenda for today. I'm going to pop it right back up there since I missed that. And then our logistics for today. So it's going to be 11 to 2 p.m. Eastern time. We're going to take a 15-minute break here around 12:20. That'll give you time to stretch your legs, go grab something to drink, and then we're going to jump right back into it. So those are going to be the logistics. And then the last thing I want to say is, if you're interested in this, right? If you're watching this event today and you're like, I really want to dive deeper into it, we do a lot of these boot camps around Azure Synapse, Azure, Power BI, DAX, Power Apps. And most of the stuff we do is private training for customers who want to train their team. So if you want to get deeper into this technology, we do boot camps with hands-on labs. We would love to do training for you. Just reach out and let us know what you're interested in, and we would love to help you with that. We also do public boot camps, right? So if you don't have to train an entire team, you just want to train a couple of people on the team, then that's the most cost-effective way to do that. You send them to those boot camps. They usually fill up pretty quick. So if that one fills up and we can find room on the calendar, we'll try to add another one before the end of the year. But take a look at that, right? If you're interested, this is a good opportunity to take and do that training. All right. So we're past all of that. We're past the introduction. We're going to jump in and take just a quick look at Azure services, really as it pertains to the data platform, because a lot of these pieces that we're talking about are in Azure Synapse Analytics. So we're going to take a look at the data platform. Then we're going to transition over and say, what is Azure Synapse Analytics? Why do we have it? What problems does it solve? And then we're going to spend the rest of the day doing demos. Well, we're just going to be working in the environment and checking that out. So this right here is a pretty standard slide that I use for a lot of my training, and I make some customizations to it. Very similar to the one that I did when I did the Azure Data Services class, but I made a couple small modifications. The modifications that I made, you might notice, are going to be right here in the middle of the screen, right? So right here I have my pipelines and data flows. It's really that icon that represents Azure Synapse Analytics. So the data platform in Azure is essentially how do we take all of our data that we have in all of these different data sources, whether they're in Dynamics, on-prem, they're in Azure, they're in SharePoint, wherever that data might live, and how do we get that data into our dedicated warehouse, right? And so there's a couple of different methods that we can do that. And then where do we load the data? Do we load it into a SQL pool, to an Azure SQL database, to a data lake? There's lots of options that are available to us. In fact, part of the reason that we have ASA today is because there are so many options, and the goal around ASA is to kind of simplify that process. But we're going to circle back to that in just a moment. So we have all of these different data sources, and we want to get that into our data warehouse. Well, what we can do is we can leverage pipelines and data flows. Now, if that terminology sounds familiar to you, that's because it is. The pipelines and data flows that we get in Azure Synapse Analytics are the same pipelines and data flows that we used over in Data Factory. There's a couple of small little differences between the two. There's a couple of little things that you can do in Synapse you can't do over here, and you can do over here and you can't do over there, but they're very minor. And there is a document out there on Microsoft Docs that kind of highlights the differences. So if you're trying to make the decision of which one do you go with, look at that document. I try to point most people to ASA, to Azure Synapse Analytics, but that's why this would sound familiar. If it doesn't sound familiar to you at all, if you're brand new to Azure, pipelines and data flows is a graphical user interface. It's a UI-driven way of building a workflow that essentially does ETL, extract your data, transform the data, apply business rules, and then load it into the final destination. Most people who are on here have probably worked with SSIS, right? And so it's very similar to SSIS in that respect. Now, the other method that we have for doing ETL and transforming and cleaning data is notebooks. You've probably worked with notebooks or heard of notebooks, maybe Databricks or Jupyter notebooks. Well, inside of Azure Synapse Analytics, we have notebooks. And very often I have conversations with data engineers who are responsible for cleaning and transforming that data, who want to and prefer to actually use notebooks rather than using pipelines and data flows. Now, full transparency, that's not me. I loved SSIS. I like Data Factory. I like pipelines and data flows. But I get it. Notebooks give you a lot of flexibility and a lot of scalability. They give you a lot of control that you might not get with something that's prepackaged and you have those components, right? And so notebooks are pretty cool. A lot of capability there for cleaning your data. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into notebooks, as you can imagine. Now, finally, once we clean the data up, we've transformed it, we've curated it in some way, we want to load it into the final destination. And once again, when you're working in Azure, it seems like unlimited options for what you can do with your data, the different services available where I can load my data. Really, when we're looking at the data platform, though, we're looking at either probably a dedicated SQL pool, an Azure SQL database, or maybe our data lake, okay? And so that's what we're gonna be talking about as we progress through the next 3 hours together. Once we load that data into our dedicated SQL pool, then we can choose to maybe put that data or read the data using Power BI. So Power BI is another critical piece of this integration in Azure Synapse Analytics. And the one thing that I want to be a constant theme as we go through this workshop together today is the integration that exists within Azure Synapse Analytics and how it really just makes a lot of things a little bit cleaner, a little bit easier than how we used to do things in Azure. So I really enjoy the tool. I like the direction of where it's going, and I'm excited to be doing this workshop today. All right. The other thing that's on this slide is it's kind of a conversation around ASA. It's the fact that Azure Synapse Analytics, and we're going to get into this in a second, is a unified development environment for really all of your personas within that data platform space. And what I mean by that is your data analyst who just need to do ad hoc queries against the data, your data engineers who need to clean up the data, transform it and load it, and then your data scientists who want to build those machine learning models. All of those personas within your organization can now work together in a collaborative way. All right, and so this is really awesome. Obviously, your data scientist is probably not going to be building pipelines and data flows, right? The engineers are going to be doing that. And notebooks are not going to be something that are used by your data analyst. They're not going to be writing Python and .NET code to build a notebook, but your engineers and your data scientists might be. So you have all of these different technologies that are built into ASA so you can get that collaborative development and really integration with the different personas and the different technologies. The other thing that I want to talk about real quick before I jump into the next slide, there are a lot of people that join these live events and we love it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of comments and a lot of questions. I am not going to have time to like scroll through those. I'll be distracted the entire time. So Matt's going to feed me some questions throughout the day and I'll glance over and try to answer them as I can. And then when we take a break later, I'll spend that break looking through questions and trying to do that. But expect a follow-up video from us. We'll do a Q&A video where we go back through and answer a lot of those questions that you guys have. And then subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're going to be doing a lot of videos on Synapse Analytics and dropping videos on that so you can stay up to date with, whatever it is that we're doing videos on. All right, I just wanted to put that out there real quick in case you're like, hey, they're not answering my questions. You guys see the chat. There's a lot of stuff that's going to be happening in there. All right. So the next thing we want to take a look at is just kind of some of the core technologies that are in ASA. First of all, every Azure Synapse Analytics workspace requires a data lake to be set up and configured. And so every ASA workspace will have one primary data lake by default. That is a requirement. We're going to need that. The data lake is just going to be a general purpose storage account that we use. And this is where we can store our files, obviously, that we can then load for our data platform. Or maybe we just store them there and we query those files directly. That's pretty awesome. And we're going to be talking about that. That's going to be one of the first demos we do. How do we interact with those files that are in our data lake using Azure Synapse Analytics? We're also going to be talking a lot about dedicated and serverless pools. SQL pools give us the capability to do analysis against big data, right? Dedicated SQL pool used to be known as the Azure SQL Data Warehouse. On-prem, it used to be known as Parallel Data Warehouse or PDW. And this gives us that massive parallel processing architecture so that we can scale out horizontally and we can run big data analytics when we have lots of data. And so, when you're working with something like SQL Server on-prem or Azure SQL database, you keep throwing as much hardware as you can at it, and you're trying to scale up vertically by adding more CPU, adding more memory, and improving your hard drives. But at some point, you get diminishing returns. It just doesn't benefit you. So if you have a lot of data, dedicated SQL pools, serverless is going to help you out with running those very large queries. So you can quickly run complex queries against petabytes of data with that. Notebooks, another awesome and cool feature that's available within Synapse Analytics. As we talked about a moment ago, notebooks give us the capability of cleaning up the data, transforming the data, doing some cool stuff with it, but also you can build your machine learning models here. You can test them, you can train them, then you can save that off and you can score those models. So if you're a data scientist and you want to do your work in here, you absolutely can. And I do know people today where we've trained customers and they are using this as their tool of choice, right? Now, one of the things with this is you're probably using other tools today as well. So how do you make that migration? How do you eventually get on this tool? That's a conversation that we're having to have with a lot of customers also. And then, of course, pipelines and data flows. You'll notice I left a picture of Data Factory on here because the pipelines and the data flows that we use to move that data, to transform that data and load it into the final destination are the same components and the same things that we were working with in Data Factory. So if you're coming from Data Factory and you're looking at ASA for the first time, you're going to find out that there's a lot of similarities and a lot of functionality that is very, very like what you're used to. So you'll pick it up very quickly there. All right. And then, of course, the last but not least, the integration with Power BI. So from Azure Synapse Analytics Workspace, you can connect directly to an existing workspace. You can build new reports off of the data sets in that workspace. You can look at existing reports and you can edit them and change them. So there's that integration, which is awesome, super easy to use. But then you can also connect to your Azure Synapse Analytics environment from Power BI Desktop. That can be done using both dedicated pools and serverless pools, which gives you just a lot of capability there that we're going to talk about as we get near the end of the 3-hour session today. So there's a lot of technologies here. There's a lot of stuff here. I'm going to go through some slides. I think I have about 10 or so slides that talk about ASA, and then we're going to spend pretty much the rest of the day doing demos, and we'll see how many demos we get through for this 3-hour workshop. And then, of course, take a look at our YouTube channel for follow-up videos that dive deeper into different pieces of ASA after the event is over. All right. So with that being said, we're going to go in here. And we did have a question. So why Azure Synapse SQL is so basic compared to MS SQL Server 2019? And that question came from Ed. So I don't know exactly what that means when you say basic. It is important to understand that, when you're working with, so one of the complaints that people have had around dedicated SQL pools for years, right? Even back when it was on-prem, is that one of the limitations is the syntax that you can do from a SQL perspective. There are limitations on, foreign keys and primary keys, unique constraints. There's a lot of definitely limitations there, but those limitations exist because of the way that the engine in the background is processing big data. There's concurrency limitations. So there's definitely times where, dedicated SQL pool is the right choice. And there's times where, a regular SQL database is the right choice. And I see companies having both, right? I have big data, terabytes of data, 10 years of data that we're analyzing that we really need to be able to churn through quickly. So we're using that for our dedicated pool. And then maybe your smaller data marts, you might be using an Azure SQL database. And so I see what you're saying and where you're probably coming from with the limitations. They do exist when you're used to SQL Server, right? And probably all of us are coming from that background, but they're necessary. And I will say, I worked with, and it was on-prem, right? I know a lot of consultants here at Pragmatic Works who work with PDW on-prem, and SQL pools today have come a really long way from where we started. So there's a lot of new capabilities that are built in, so it's not as limited as it once was. All right. So let's talk about Azure Synapse Analytics specifically. Let's dive into that. Right now, we have something called, and this is the Microsoft, I love it, the Microsoft marketing. We have what's known as the paradox of analytics. And I want to dive into that. One thing, when I go back to my consulting days, right, I had SQL Server BI Suite, I had SSIS, I had analysis services, I had reporting services, and that was kind of it. And, I'd go 3 or 4 years and I'd work with the same technologies, and then there would be an update and I would learn it, but I'd still be working with the same technologies. And you'd get new technologies from time to time, but it was always a pretty hefty upfront cost, right? So customers didn't always introduce those new technologies. But once we moved to the cloud, we have all of these technologies at our fingertips. I mean, we're going to be talking about dedicated pools today. A dedicated pool, if a customer wanted to implement this MPP architecture on-prem, they would spend, I believe the number was roughly about $250,000, $250,000 to buy an appliance. Then they would have to pay for consultants and training to get that up and running. To build a proof of concept, you're, $250,000, $500,000 in the hole. But in the cloud, we can spin up a dedicated pool for $1.50 an hour and start working with it and build a proof of concept. And that is across the board, right? So we can experience and we can explore and we can learn all these new technologies, and all these new resources are at our fingertips. And that's great in a lot of ways, but it also can create some problems across an organization. And that's what the paradox of analytics is. The paradox of analytics is where a lot of companies are now having siloed data that is difficult to bring together, because I have these developers over here that are using Databricks, these developers over here using Synapse Notebooks, these developers over here using some other technology that does something similar, but is ever so slightly different. And it doesn't really, I don't have a good way to bring it all together, right? So we've always had siloed data because of data stores. I have data in SharePoint and Excel and on-prem and Azure. That's always been a problem, and that's the evolution of why we have a data warehouse for analytics. We bring it all together. But now we're creating these silos of data as a result of technology. And this is being created by the fact that we have all these technologies at our fingertips. So that is kind of the paradox of analytics, right? We know that data is growing. We know that companies are storing more data than ever before. And as that data grows, less and less data is really being analyzed because systems can't keep up with it. And that's why we have things like dedicated pools to be able to process that big data, to be able to really churn through it. But the data volumes are growing, right? Analytics and AI is the number one investment for business leaders, yet they struggle to get a return on their investment. We see this across the board, right? We've seen this for many years. And so one of the biggest problems with that return, though, and one of the big problems that companies are having is exactly right here, what we talked about before. These siloed sections of our data that result as a result of data, the data stores, where it's stored, where the data is coming from. But now we're running into skills and technologies, right? So we have all these different technologies that are causing our data to be siloed as well. And so one of the things, and I'm going to talk about it here on probably the next slide, one of the goals with Azure Synapse Analytics is to solve this problem with the paradox of analytics, right? So each new technology creates another siloed operation that it brings it harder and harder for us to bring our data together. So with Azure Synapse Analytics, we're introducing here the analytics continuum. And the goal is that all of the jobs that you need to do as a data professional for the data platform, we can bring those technologies into a single platform, a single workspace, a unified environment for all of your personas, your analysts, your engineers, and your data scientists. So if you need to do data exploration or artificial intelligence, machine learning, data warehousing, real-time business intelligence, or data integration, guess what? We can do all of that now in Azure Synapse Analytics with the core technologies that we've already reviewed. And so a big purpose and a big goal of taking a look at Azure Synapse Analytics is figuring out, do these core technologies work for our company? And yes, maybe there is some flashy new technology over here that does this thing, but do we really, really need it? And understanding that as we continue to adopt new technologies, it can create problems. And I've done training, consulting for so many companies that do have this problem today. Right? They have exactly these problems where they're using all these different services, and they're even bringing on people and they're like, oh, you don't have to know this technology because you know this technology, which is going to obviously cause a problem right out the gate because they're going to use what they know, right? And so right here, Matt says, we got another question from Digital. Will we be covering Expression Builder in Azure pipelines? So we won't today, but I have a ton of YouTube videos that go deeper into that. Intermediate, advanced level YouTube videos and demos. Definitely check those out. I won't be getting into those today, but if you email me directly, Pearson@pragmaticworks.com, Matt will give it, I'll send you those links. Considering the various technologies used today, would you recommend ETL or ELT approach when using Synapse, and why? That's an interesting one. So here's the thing. That's a great question. FSCO Digital. Because when we start developing in the cloud, there's a paradigm shift in the way that we think. On-prem, give me the hardware, give me the infrastructure. I don't really think about cost. A lot of times, you're thinking about cost in the cloud. And so do I use data flows within Synapse pipelines, which is going to cost me money? It's going to spin up a Databricks cluster in the background. Or do I maybe just dump the data directly into my dedicated pool, which is always running, that always is going to cost me X number of dollars per hour, and then I just do the transformation in a stored procedure afterwards? Great questions, right? It really depends on a lot of different factors, how much data you're working with. I like, obviously, the UI experience of pipelines and data flows and being able to graphically walk through it. I'm a visual person. I love that experience, so I would lean towards that. But from a cost perspective, if I'm noticing that those data flows are costing me a lot of money, I'm going to say, hey, maybe I can re-engineer this, load the data into the dedicated pool, then run a stored procedure to clean it up afterwards, right? So ELT is very popular for getting the data out of the source system fast, just get it out. But now in the cloud, we can also talk about cost, right? Does it make more sense to do the data transformation, maybe cleaning the data, curating it in my dedicated pool after I load it into a staging table? Or is it just as well to do it as I go through? So there is no exact answer on this. I don't have one for your organization. We'd have to look at a lot of different criteria there, but it is a great question. Great conversation starter there. Maybe that can be a YouTube video we follow up on and look at a couple different scenarios. But here it is, right? This is all the different things that we need to do, and all of this is part of Azure Synapse Analytics. It's part of this continuum, all right? I think we're pretty close to getting near the end of the slides here. What I want to take a look at as we transition into the demos is I do want to walk through the process of provisioning ASA and talking about different factors. Now, I've already provisioned my environment. I've already provisioned resources, right? We want to get the most out of this 3-hour workshop. But I do want to take a look at what does it look like to provision it? What are some of those key elements that you need to know about? And then we're going to kind of move on from there. And then we're going to do a navigation of ASA. So if you've never been in ASA before, Azure Synapse Analytics, we're going to jump in there right now for the first time. You're going to get a view of what this looks like. If you've been in Data Factory, but not ASA, you're going to find out that the experience is very similar. It's very similar, and there's a lot of great capabilities in both. So I think that brings us to our very first demo here. Let me go ahead and bring up my ASA environment and my Azure portal. All right. So I'm going to be in the Azure portal. Like I mentioned from the very beginning earlier, I'm not going to be doing a introduction into Azure and going through the Azure portal. We've done that class, Learn with the Nerds. I think it was called Azure Data Services. Please, if you're interested in that, go back and check it out. But I do want to walk you through what it looks like to create an Azure Synapse Analytics workspace. So the first thing I will do is in the Azure portal, I'm going to go ahead and click right here to create a resource. And then for the resource right here, I am going to search for Synapse, right? So we'll go ahead and search for Synapse. I'm going to look for Azure Synapse Analytics right there. And then I'm going to go ahead and create and walk through the steps. Now, I would encourage you for the video here, I want to give you guys as much bang for your buck. So that's why I didn't give you files in advance and I don't have you following along. But if you look at the description after this video is over, I'm going to upload some files so you can kind of go through it and watch the video again. All right, so I will provide that afterwards. But for now, I'm going to go a little bit quicker than I would if you were in one of my boot camps and we were doing a deep dive. And that's because it's going to be recorded. You can pause it, you can stop it, you can go back. So I want to give you as much as I can, right? I'm going to go ahead and click create here. And when I click create, just like any other resource, I'm going to go through and choose my subscription. I'll choose my resource group here, Azure Synapse Workshop. And then I have to choose a managed resource group name. All right, so what this is this is going to store ancillary objects and items that are managed by Azure Synapse Analytics. So that is a requirement. If you don't provide a name, it will actually create this like crazy GUID. So I like to provide a name. A lot of times I'll give it the exact same name as my ASA environment and just add MRG to the end. Or I'll name it the same as my resource group if I know that resource group is only going to have one ASA. So I would come in here and say, you know what, let's go with Azure Synapse Workshop, Learn with the Nerds, Manage Resource Group. And I've probably already created it, so I'll type it in twice. All right, so that is going to be a requirement. You'll give it a workspace name. So Azure Synapse Analytics Workshop, whatever you want to call your ASA. This does have to be unique because that workspace name is technically a server that you can connect to. So whenever you want to connect to your dedicated pools, whenever you want to connect to your serverless pools, you're going to be connecting right here to this. All right. And then I got a good question here. I don't know if it's a good question, but Peter Smith is always here. So because I saw his name, I'm going to answer that question. As someone who has never worked with Synapse before, what would be the compelling argument to pick Synapse over SQL Server database, other than Microsoft pushing Synapse at all cost? So the big thing, and I still push a lot of customers, Peter, to SQL database, right? I like SQL database. It's intuitive. I understand it. I understand SQL pools too, but SQL pools, and here's another thing. Let's talk about this real quick. A lot of people today have a lot of confusion over, they think Synapse is dedicated SQL pools, and that's just not the case. There's a lot of other capabilities in Azure Synapse Analytics so that you can still open up and create an Azure Synapse workspace without ever provisioning a dedicated pool. I get this conversation all the time with customers when we're scoping engagements, and they're like, no, let's do everything in Data Factory because we're not interested in dedicated pools. I'm like, no. We can still do everything in Synapse Analytics, and it gives us great integration capabilities without ever provisioning a dedicated pool. So that was a little bit of a marketing snafu by Microsoft where everybody thinks that Synapse Analytics is dedicated pools, and that's not the case. It's all these different technologies. We can create an ASA environment without ever provisioning a SQL pool. The big reason for dedicated SQL pools is big data, right? If you have data scientists that are going to be churning through terabytes, petabytes of data, SQL pools are going to be the most cost-effective solution for that. You can spin up a SQL pool, you can run it for as long as you need, you can pause it, and you can save money on the compute because it doesn't have to run all the time. So if you're doing big data analytics, you need to improve the performance of your dashboards, and you can't really get it there with the SQL database, or you know that your data volumes are going to grow and you just want to go ahead and get it set up in dedicated pools, that's where you can start. But there's still a lot of customers that are on SQL database, and SQL database is still a very, very strong tool for analytics as well. So good question. Once again, not an exact answer. It depends on your data, your organization, how much data you're working with. And there's been customers I've pointed both directions. Absolutely. So we give it a name, we go to East US 2, and then we have to now choose our data lake. Remember I told you, we must set up a data lake, a primary data lake for the ASA environment. That is a requirement. So we'll do that, and then we have to provide a default container or a default file system. And so I can go down here and grab one that I've already created, and there we go. Now next, and I'm just going to walk through these real quick to talk about a couple key elements. Next, you have to provide a server name and a password. This is SQL Server authentication by default. Now, once you provision it, you can go into the Azure portal and you can set up your Azure Active Directory. You can set it up to be yourself or some other service account, whatever it is, but you can set up an AAD account on this workspace once it's done and never use this server admin again. But you do have to set it up from the beginning, and so that is going to be a requirement. And then there's one more thing here that's pretty critical. I might have missed it. I missed it on the last slide. This right here is the main problem that users run into with ASA, specifically with serverless pools, okay? If you want to query data that's in your data lake and you get this, I haven't had this error in probably, I don't know, 6 months, but it's a very random error message that you get. But you got to make sure that you are a storage blob data contributor on the data lake to be able to query it. And you might say, well, Mitchell, I'm an owner on the data lake, right? Owner surely is enough permissions. No. Unless they've changed something recently, no. You have to be an owner and, well, you don't have to be an owner, but you do have to have storage blob data contributor. That is what ASA looks for when you're running those serverless queries against your data lake. So if you add additional data lakes to your ASA environment, you need to go back and make sure you are a blob data contributor on those. All right, this is one of the most common errors that I see. This will do it automatically for the primary, for the person who's provisioning it. But if you add additional people to your Synapse workspace, you want to add them in. All right, very important, very important. You put this in. Under networking, this is very critical. I have a 30-minute video that dives deep into understanding virtual networks for securing your environment. So I'm not going to talk about it here. That's a video I would recommend that you go out and watch as well. How to set that up and how that helps you get around kind of, public IP issues and stuff like that. And then right here at the bottom, you can tell it to allow connections from all IPs. Not safe, great for proof of concept testing, right? I turn this on, and then usually afterwards I go into the firewall rules and I turn it off. I put only the necessary IP addresses. And so the one I'm doing today only has my IP address. Nobody else will be able to try to authenticate or connect. All right, and that's it. That is the steps for creating an ASA workspace. It's not hard. And notice, going back to Peter's question, notice I did not provision a dedicated pool. So you don't have to provision a dedicated pool in this process. All right, I'm going to hit cancel because, like I said, I've already provisioned that resource, and now we're going to go over to my ASA environment. Now, a shortcut for this is, if you don't want to go through the Azure portal, you can just go straight to web.azuresynapse.net, and when you go straight to Azure web.azuresynapse.net, it'll let you log directly into your Synapse workspace without having to go through the Azure portal. So that's very convenient and a really nice feature there. Let me walk you through a real quick overview of ASA, and then we're going to dump into really our first demo here, where we take a look at querying data and the integration of all these different awesome components that exist within Synapse Analytics. So first, over here on the left-hand side, we have this navigation pane. Once again, if you've been in Data Factory, and I bet a lot of you have, this looks very similar in a lot of ways. If I scroll in over here, you'll notice we have the Home Hub. These are called hubs. The first hub here is the Home Hub. This gives you kind of your recent resources that you've been working with. It shows you how you can do a quick ingest of data, explore and analyze data, also visualizing Power BI. I don't really use any of these links on this website, not on this page. However, if we go down to the Data Hub, the Data Hub is where you have your various databases, your dedicated pools. You can see I've already provisioned one. Your dedicated pools, your serverless pools, we'll talk about that, your serverless databases, and then also your Spark databases. So you can also create a Spark database right here that has tables on it as well. So all of my databases are going to show up here under Workspace in the Data Hub. I'm also going to go over to Linked. Linked is going to show me essentially all of my storage accounts. So you'll notice that by default, I have my primary storage account right here, and my primary storage account is called Azure Synapse. I'm trying to pull that over. There we go. And my primary storage account is called Azure Synapse Workshop, and that has all of the data that I'm going to be using for the demos that I do today. And then down here, I have a file system called Training, a container called Training, and within that, it opens up a tab across the top. I have a couple of different folders, and within those folders, I have files, right? So this is going to be cool. You're going to see the integration as we work through the class today. We're going to be doing a lot from this Home Hub or this Data Hub, because we're going to come back and we're going to do some cool stuff with this. All right, so we'll come back there in just a minute. Under the Develop Hub, this is where you create your SQL scripts. This is where you create your notebooks. This is where you create your data flows. So if you want to create a data flow, you want to create a notebook, you want to create a SQL script, you do it right here from the Develop Hub. The other thing I want to point out that's really awesome with Azure Synapse Analytics is the ability to come down here and browse the gallery. When I was first learning ASA, when it first came out, I first got access to it, Microsoft always does a really great job of giving you templates, right? Pre-built templates. They do it in Logic Apps, Power Automate, they do it here, they do it everywhere. And I like to open up those templates and kind of reverse engineer them and figure out how to do things, right? And so if you click on Browse Gallery right here, it brings us over here to where we can see all of these different notebooks that are pre-built, and we can work through them and see exactly how did they connect to those data sources, how did you use those packages, how did you import them, how did you do those things. You can reverse engineer them, and you'll notice right here, this is a machine learning notebook that uses PySpark. This is another one that does some predictions using PySpark. And then there's another one here, that's machine learning. This right here is how to do charting in Synapse. There's a lot of great examples that use publicly available open data sets. So if your company hasn't blocked it, you can come in here, you can open these up, and you can walk through all of these different notebooks. There's a ton of them. Lots of great learning opportunities in here. But there's also things out here for data sets. So if you want data just to play around with and you're like, I don't know where the data is, you can come out here and you can grab some of these data sets that are available. You can also come over here and look at some pre-built pipelines and maybe get some inspiration from that as well. So we're not going to be doing that today. I'm going to kind of walk through some things from scratch, but I would encourage you, if you want to learn more about this and really dive in, I would encourage you to check out these different templates, right? And so the way that we got there again is over here from the Develop Hub. When I click the plus icon where I can add a new SQL script or create a new notebook, create a new data flow, I can also come down here and browse gallery. All right. You can also import notebooks and data flows and SQL scripts into your environment as well. And that's what that import means. So that is the home, the data, and the Develop Hub. The next hub is the Integrate Hub. This is essentially where you create pipelines. So if you want to create pipelines that are going to copy data from one place to another, run a stored procedure, filter tables out, send an email notification, all of that cool stuff there, we do that right here from the Integrate Hub. Once again, this workshop is not going to be focused heavily on ETL, although we will get to this later. But we do have, other videos on our YouTube channel, tons of other videos focused specifically on this aspect, ETL, pipelines, and data flows. So definitely check those out afterwards. Not now, check them out afterwards. All right, we're going to go over to the Monitor Hub. I love the monitoring that's built in. The built-in monitoring is, of course, it could be more robust. There could be all these other things, but just out of the box, what you get is really awesome here. And so you can go in and do monitoring on your SQL pools. You can look at your Spark pools, any SQL request. I'm going to be talking a lot about this here in just a moment. I kind of served up a bunch of SQL requests this morning so we can talk about it. You can look at any data flow debug operations that are currently running and turn those off. And then you, of course, have your pipeline runs. And then you have your scheduled runs and then integration runtime. So that's pretty self-explanatory there. And then under Manage, this is where you can create a dedicated pool, or this is where you can create a Spark pool. This is where you create connection managers with link services. If you want to set up Azure PureView, which is still in preview, this is where you would come and take a look at that. If you want to set up scheduled jobs, you do it right here under Triggers. And then we can set up and do some security things here as well. And then, of course, we can also set up Git configuration. This right here, workspace packages, this is related to notebooks. So you can actually connect and import workspace packages or different packages you want to use in your notebooks. You can import them right here, and then they'll be available to your notebooks. All right. All right. So that's a real quick overview. Like I said, we're not going to be diving deep into all these different topics. I just want to get you familiar with the interface, get you familiar with the integration of all these different tools and how they help us to solve what we were talking about earlier, that paradox of analytics, because you're going to find out that the technologies that are built into Azure Synapse Analytics really do help us with most of what we need to do for the data platform, those different roles. All right, so the first demo I want to do, I'm ready. We're going to jump right into the first demo here, is going to be using serverless pools. All right, serverless on demand. What is this? This is cool. I'm trying not to go back to the PowerPoint any more than I need to. Serverless pools is where we are essentially going to be saying, look, I want to query data that's in my data lake using SQL, and I want to be able to scale that out. I want to get great performance, even if it's big data, but I don't want to have to go spin up a dedicated pool. And so companies shouldn't have to spin up and leave a dedicated pool running all the time. And so if the pool's paused and it's not running and I want to run a query, then I have to go and turn the pool on, and that pool is going to be running and it's going to charge me X number of dollars per hour for me just to go and run a couple of ad hoc queries, right? That's not very flexible, not very helpful. And so serverless SQL on demand gives us the capability of kind of just-in-time reporting. It gives us the capability of running a lot of ad hocs and interacting with our data and doing some, just kind of exploration of our data without requiring a dedicated pool. This is game-changing in a lot of ways, because before this, you would have had to, had your dedicated pool running, which can cost quite a bit of money per hour that it runs, right? So this dedicated pool that I've provisioned right here for this workshop, this is costing me right now $1.50 an hour. It's not a lot of money. It's the lowest tier you can absolutely go with. But it's going to cost me every hour that it runs. I can pause it and I can turn it off. But if I do, anything that I was using, any scripts, any Power BI reports, whatever, anything that was using that dedicated P1 database is not going to work until it's turned back on. So I'm saving money, but it's highly inconvenient. So instead, the way we can kind of work around that problem is we can use serverless. Let me show you what this is. Every ASA environment by default has serverless pools available to you. It's there. You can use it if you want. Don't use it if you don't want. Serverless pools cost you $5 per terabyte of data processed. That can be pretty inexpensive, and I'm going to show you that here in a minute when we go back and look at monitoring, okay? So $5 per terabyte of data that is processed. So let's do this. Let's go out to our data lake and just query some data and take a look at it. So I'm going to go back over to the data hub. Under the data hub, I have some data that I've already uploaded to my data lake, right? So I'm looking at my data lake under linked right here. We're in the data hub, I'm in the linked category, and I'm going to come down to my training folder, and I'm going to go into let's just do training data for this demo here. And I'm going to right click on this holiday file. Now I'm going to be using this Parquet file. I'm going to right click and notice what happens. This is the integration that really puts ASA over the top. I love this. When I right click on this file, I can do new SQL script. I can create a new notebook from here. I can start a new data flow that's connected directly to this file. I can also go in and create a new integration data set right here. And then once again, I'm not sharing my screen. Thank you, Matt, for that. Letting you guys down. I'm going to click data right here and then linked, and I'm right here inside of the notebook. All right, so now I'm going to go back over here and right click on this file. And when I right click on that file, I can do these different things. I'm repeating it because I wasn't sharing my screen again. So we'll do SQL script, new notebook, new data flow, and then new integration data set. We're going to kind of work through all of these through the remainder of this workshop. But for now, I'm going to do new SQL script. And I'm going to say I want to select the top 100 rows. All right, top 100 rows. And that's going to write a SQL script that looks like this. Now, a couple of elements I want to point out. First of all, right here at the top, you can see that I'm connected to the built-in SQL pool, which is serverless. I only get billed for what I use, right? So it's running all the time pretty much, kind of. It's running, it's ready to go. I don't have to worry about pausing it or turning it on or scaling it up or scaling it down. It's running all the time. That's huge. That's good. And so now, anytime I run a query against that, I'm going to get billed usually fractions of a penny, and I'll show you that in just a moment. And I'm going to be pointing to, since I'm not really pointing to a serverless database, we haven't created one yet, I'm just going to be running a query to my master database. All right. So now I'm going to run this query right here that is returning top 100 rows from that holiday file. And so I come over here and click run. And it's going to show me the results right here at the very bottom. There we go. And now we have our results. And so we just took data that was in our data lake and we queried the data. Super easy, super fast. We didn't have to load it in table. If I'm a data analyst, I don't have to reach out to my IT team and say, hey, I want to see what's in that file. I don't have to download it, right? I just query the data. You will notice that we're using open row set. So it's a little bit hard from a syntax perspective to kind of just type that in if you want to run it from scratch. But there are a couple of little workarounds for that we're going to talk about, okay? You can also change this. This is SQL at this point, so you could do aggregations, you can do where clauses, you can do group bys. All of that's available to you. Now, here's what I want to talk about. Here's what I want to dive into. How do we, in fact, let me take another example real quick that has more data. So I'm going to close and I'm going to discard that script. And I'm going to go over to my training folder again. Let me go back one. And I'm going to open up the taxi data. In my taxi data, I have about 100 megabytes of, no, I have about 1,000. I don't know. I have a lot of data in here. And I'm going to right click on one of these files. and I'm going to do a new SQL script, select top 100. Now this is quite a bit of data. I think this is about 100 million rows of data. So not too much, but it's quite a bit. If I run this script, it's going to run pretty fast, right? It's pretty efficient because it is using the SQL pool capability. But what's happening here is actually that just ran for the one file. So actually, remember we did it on a file. So I want to change this file right here, and I actually want to run it for all files in that entire directory. So what I can do is I'm pointing to my training folder, pointing to the taxi data directory, and I'm going to just put a little wildcard in here with an asterisk. There we go. And now I'm going to run it again. And I can run it with Shift-Enter. So I'm going to hit Shift-Enter on my keyboard, let that run, and now I just queried all of the data in that entire folder, which is, once again, about 100 million rows of data. The only problem with this is not a lot of data in terms of big data. And we know that with serverless, right, with serverless, every query that I run with serverless is going to cost some amount of money, right? Usually it's not going to cost that much. I'm going to teach you kind of where you can go to find this. So let's take a look at this cost real quick. If I go back over to the monitoring hub, we just ran a SQL on-demand query. If I go to the monitoring hub and I go over to SQL request right here, monitor SQL request, you'll see all of these different queries that I ran. The one that I just ran was this one right here. All right, 1145. And it does look like it might have been pulling back some cache data there. So I need to change that query to get better results. But what we should have seen is this right here, this query right here. This is what we should have seen, all right? And this is going to return about 84 megabytes of data processed. So remember, the way you get billed for SQL pools on demand is $5 per terabyte processed, which means that if you do the math, $5 divided by 1 million times 84, this is literally fractions of a penny. All these queries are like fractions of a penny. So it's not a lot of money for SQL on demand. This is just one way you can come in here and see which queries are costing you the most money. And you can also connect to this from Management Studio, and there are DMVs you can run and there are scripts you can run to tell you exactly how much data is being processed. But also you can come in and actually look at the query here. So you can dive deeper into the actual query. So if you're having a problem with queries that are costing a little bit too much money, that are not effectively built, you can come in here, find the problem, and then maybe figure out a better and more effective way of doing that, right? So this is a great way to kind of look at the cost. The other thing I want to show you here for serverless is you can control the cost a little bit. So if you're afraid that you're going to have this turned on in ASA and you got 1,000 users that are going to be working in here and doing all this, and it's going to just, the cost is going to grow out of control, there's a really, really easy way to control the cost. What you can do, I'm going to walk you through this, is we can go back over to Manage, right? And so in the Manage Hub, we can go to SQL Pools and we can find this SQL pool right here. This is the built-in, this is the serverless. And if I click on this little cost control button, when I hover over it, it pops up. I can click on that, go over to the blade on the right, and then right here, I can come in here and I can say, hey, I want to set the daily limit up to be, 10 terabytes or 5 terabytes or 1 terabyte. So you can minimum at the daily level, the weekly level, and the monthly level, you can minimize the amount of data that's being processed. And once you hit that limit, it'll stop, right? It won't let it go any further. So you can set these hard limits to make sure that you are managing cost. All right, so that is cost control, really easy to set up. And that gives us some insight into working with serverless on demand. Now here's the deal, Mitchell. All right, we have all of our data for the last 10 years, literally petabytes of data, terabytes of data, and it's all in one folder. And whenever we query that data, even when we add a where clause, it's reading all the data that's in that folder. Is there a better way to query the data so that we don't process as much data, we return the results faster, and we don't get charged as much money, right? Great question. The answer to that is yes. And so what we can do is we can store the data in our data lake in a different way. We can store it maybe as partition data to where each year is in its own folder. And then when we write our serverless queries, we can write it directly against that folder. And that way we get partition elimination, reducing cost and also going in there and possibly improving performance. So when you run, I got a question here from Big Pix 2000. So when you run it, it charges against your subscription instantly. No, it does not. What it does is it shows you how much it's cost or what, how much data you've processed. And when you get your monthly bill, you can kind of see that that's where it came from. So if your monthly bill is, out of control for serverless and you didn't set up a cost control center and you don't know what's going on, you can go back into monitoring, look at all the SQL queries that were run, see who ran them, see how big they were, and then you get into what I'm talking about right now, which is how can we maybe manage cost by improving the queries that we write. So, good question. Let me go ahead and open back up the PowerPoint, and we're going to jump all the way down to notebooks real quick. And I think I just have like 2 slides on notebooks that I want to show real quick here. So let me pull that back up before we dive in. So I like notebooks. I don't do a lot with notebooks. I prefer pipelines and data flows. But what I do like about notebooks is the documentation capabilities. I love that with notebooks, we can go in there and we can add all of our documentation right there with the code. So as you're stepping through the code, you have the documentation that explains what you're doing. You can do that. I loved it in Databricks. I like it in Azure Synapse notebooks. I really like that capability. So in a notebook, you can store your live code. You can do visualizations. I don't know that I would really do it for that when we have tools like Power BI. And then you can also do documentation. The Spark pools is the compute that is used to run your code. Whether you're using Python or Spark SQL or Scala or .NET, all of those notebooks are going to run against a Spark pool, all right, an Apache Spark pool. So that is going to be your compute. And I'll talk a little bit about provisioning a Spark pool and what the options are here in just a little bit as we continue to go through this. Why would we use notebooks? Well, you can absolutely use them as a replacement for pipelines and data flows, right? You can definitely use them to build and prepare your data, to clean your data up, to curate it. But a lot of times this is what's going to be used by your data scientists. They're going to be using this to do machine learning, predictive analytics, just like your dedicated SQL pool, which is a massive parallel processing architecture designed for big data. So is Apache Spark. Apache Spark also is an MPP system that scales out horizontally, so it also works really well with big data, and it's been used for big data for a very long time now. But that is going to be your compute for notebooks. Inside of a notebook, this is different for Synapse notebooks versus, if you go back over here, this is different for Synapse notebooks versus Databricks, because in Databricks we have Python, Scala, Spark SQL, and R. In Synapse, we have Python, Scala, Spark SQL, and .NET. So there's a little bit of a difference there, but these are the primary languages that you can use inside of your notebook. So if you're a Python person and you like doing Python and building notebooks, this is for you, right? All right. So that is a super, super fast, super quick introduction into notebooks. Now we're going to dive in and actually look at a really simple notebook here for the most part. Now, a minute ago we had a problem. We were querying data, 100 million rows. It's 88 megabytes of data queried, and I don't even need that because, if I go back over here and let's go back and look at this SQL query, if I come over here, I might think that if I add a where clause in here and say where, pickup month equals 1, so I'm only bringing back January of 2018, which is the data that's in here, and I run it, I might think, oh, I'm processing less data. But remember, this is reading data from files. It's not reading data from an index table, right? So that's not necessarily the case. So I run that query. We see the results down here at the bottom. If I go back over to monitor real quick, just to see that query, here it is. You'll see that it's 108 megabytes. So that's not quite what I was looking for. It had to filter down the entire table, and it's really more than when I was not running a where clause earlier. So it doesn't give you quite the expected behavior. But if I know that all of my users are only querying the current year, or they're really only querying the current month, then maybe I can partition my data to improve performance and reduce cost, reduce the amount of data processed. So how can we do that though? Well, obviously we could try to do this through pipelines and data flows, absolutely. But this is a good opportunity to kind of highlight the capabilities of notebooks as well. So let's do that. We're going to fix this problem. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go over to data. We're going to click on linked. And from linked, I'm going to go into my training folder, and then we'll go into taxi data. All right, we're already there. Now remember, this has all of my data for 2018, January, February, March, April, and I really want to split this out. I want to partition this data into different months so that when I query the data, it's partitioned and it improves performance. So I'm going to grab one of these files, doesn't matter which one, and I'm going to tell it that this time, and this is it, this is the interactivity. This is the cool thing about Synapse Analytics. I'm going to tell it I want to right click and create a new notebook. And I'm going to load this file specifically into a data frame in a notebook. That's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to click on that, and you'll notice right here across the top, look at that. We now have a notebook, and I'm going to walk through the fundamentals. I'm going to walk through the basics of this, and then we'll kind of step back. And then I got another question from Peter. Do you mind listing the DMVs or queries that show the top cost? So I don't know if I have a query specifically for, that's a good question, Peter. I don't know if I have a query specifically for that. I mean, you will be able to see all the individual queries and then you can just sort them. Matt, I sent you an additional resources folder, Matt. If you can put in the link for data processed for serverless pools, if you can put that link in there, I think that talks a little bit to what Peter is asking about right now. And I think that'll help. All right. So under notebooks right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first point to a Spark pool. I'll circle back to Spark pool in a minute and I'll show you how we provision that. But for now, I'm going to provision, or I'm going to point to the Spark pool, the compute that I want to use to run this notebook. Then if I want, I can change the primary language. I don't want, but I could. So you can go with any of these languages here for your notebook. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify this query like we did before. And I'm going to grab all of the files from that directory. So instead of pointing to a direct file, I'm actually going to put an asterisk in here, a wildcard, and I'm going to pull back all the data. So I'm loading all the data from my data lake into this notebook, into this data frame, so I can do something with it, right? So that's going to be the first thing that I do here. And then I'm going to go ahead and run this. All right. Now this is going to take a minute to run because it's going to have to go out there and it's going to provision the pool. It's going to spin up my Spark pool, which is going to take about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes, which gives us plenty of time to now go talk about how do we provision a Spark pool. So if I come over here to manage, the Manage Hub, this is where you come, we talked about this at the beginning, to create SQL pools, to provision your Spark pools, your link services, your triggers, your runtimes, all of those different things we can do right here. And so I'm going to come over here and then I'm going to click on my Apache Spark pools and I can click new. And when I click new right here, I can now come in here and actually very easily set up and provision an Apache Spark pool. You give it a name, tell it what size you want the nodes to be, right? So you choose your node size. So essentially each compute node or each computer is going to have this amount of compute associated with it. You can tell if you want to do auto scale, which means when it's running, it'll scale down to the lowest number of nodes if you're not using it, but then it has the capability to scale up. So you give it a little bit more compute. Or actually it'll scale up the nodes, it'll scale up the number of nodes that it works and you get charged per node. So I can say I want to start with 3 nodes, but if I have enough work, go ahead and distribute it across more nodes to improve performance, right? And then it gives you an idea of your estimated cost. If you turn off auto scale, it gives you a better idea of what your cost is because you're not worried about it scaling up and down. All right. Ariel Harper said, does selecting top 100 limit how much data is processed? It depends. So I think that if you do top 100 with no where clause, it'll just grab 100 rows. So it will limit because it doesn't have to read all the data. But when you add that where clause on there, I think it reads all the data in, it then filters it down, then it does top 100. So it kind of depends on the scenario. Yeah. All right. So this is where you go. You go in here, additional settings. There's really not, you'll notice this is important. And then Matt's going to put a couple of links in the chat window for you guys. But you can only have, there's Apache Spark 2.4 or 3.1. I think 3.1 is still in preview, but it actually doesn't say it here, so I'm not sure. Maybe it's now GA. You'll notice that for each version, you'll get a different version of Python, a different version of Scala, Java, .NET. So, you know, you might have to choose the Spark cluster, the Spark pool that works for the libraries and packages and code that you have, right? But this is where you might have to make some changes there. And that's really it. I mean, there's obviously a little bit more to this, but just giving you a really quick rundown of where you can go to set this up. All right, so that's where we could go to do a Spark pool. I'm going to go back over to develop, And if I go back over to develop here, this should almost be done running. So this is going to essentially read all of the data from that folder into a data frame, and then we're going to display that data, right? Here we go. We have 10 rows of data. Now, what are we going to do with it? Well, we could clean it up, right? We could get rid of columns we don't want. We could use a dot select. We could do some counts and aggregations and all of that, but we don't need to do that. Our use case, just to show off notebooks very quickly, is we want to take the data that's in the original folder and we want to load it to a new location. We want to partition it out. So let's do it. Here's how Synapse notebooks work. Probably a lot of you have some exposure and experience with Databricks. If I want to add a new code cell that cleans up the data frame, that does something with it, down here at the bottom, I can click on a new code cell. Also, I can choose a markdown cell. A markdown cell is for documentation purposes, descriptive purposes, right? So we can put some documentation into our notebook. In Databricks, you just switched between, you switch magic. So you put %MD and it made that cell a markdown cell. Here you choose if it's markdown or code. You can always change it after the fact. You'll notice that if I come back to this cell right here, I can come to the top right and I can change it to a markdown cell. I can change it to a documentation cell. I can also clear the cell output, which I'm going to do. So I get rid of all that there and gives me a little bit more room here. And then there are some other options here as far as moving it up and down, hiding the input, and also creating a parameter cell. We won't get into that today, but you can create a parameter cell. So let's create a new code cell. And what I want to do is I want to take that data frame that has all the data and I want to write that data back to my data lake. So let me kind of walk you through this. So we're going to do df dot here, and then I'm going to do a write command. So I want to write that data. I'm also going to partition that data by my pickup month. Let me make sure it's pickup month. Yes. I'm going to partition that data by my pickup month, and I'm going to do that as a Parquet file. Okay. So I'm going to do it as a Parquet file. Parquet file, by the way, is kind of the file of choice, because the file of choice here is Parquet. It gives you that schema-rich capability. It also gives you great compression, which if you think about SQL on demand, I'd rather query files that are compressed and better compressed because it can reduce cost as well. But Parquet files are great. You also get better performance with SQL on demand with Parquet files. So definitely something to look at. And while I'm going through this, Daniel asked, is Spark Pool equals Databricks? So technically, they both use Apache Spark. Yes, they both use Apache Spark. Definitely Spark Pools. And Matt, go ahead and put the links for 2.4 and 3.1 in the chat window for everybody. Spark Pools come preloaded with a ton of packages, so there's definitely differences once you start working with the different Spark Pools. But in the background, yes, they're both using Apache Spark. Databricks has just been around a little bit longer. It has some more proprietary things built into it. All right. So I'm going to tell it I want to load it as a Parquet file, and I have to tell it where I want to load the data. So I'm going to load the data to here. Let me see right here, like this. All right. ADFS training, Azure Synapse Workshop, DDS. And then I have to tell it the exact container where I want to put it. So I'm going to say training output and then partition data. I'm going to check my notes before I run this. I'm going to make sure. The other thing I might want to do is I might want to say that I want to overwrite it just in case it's already there so it doesn't fail. So I'll do mode equals overwrite. And then let me check my notes over here real quick. So partition by Parquet, all that looks great. Training output, partition date, that's where I want to put it. Okay, so I think we're good with that. And this is it. I'm now going to I'm not going to go spin up and do all the work. This would take a lot more time. To be honest with you, to do this in a pipeline or a data flow, I feel like would take me a lot more time. So within seconds, I can just read the data, pull it into a notebook, and write that and partition that data. So that now I can write SQL on-demand queries directly against the data I want, which we could use for Power BI reports, we could use for dashboards, we can connect directly to that data, reading less data and improving performance. So now I'm going to run this cell. I'm going to click right here on the left-hand side. I'm going to run the cell. While we're running that, a couple of things. If you're using Markdown language for documentation, the outline is awesome. It kind of builds an H1, H2, H3 heading on the left-hand side that kind of walks you through a notebook. I love that capability right there in notebooks. Also over here on the left, if you want to look at the value of any of the variables you've defined, you don't have to necessarily print them, right? Historically speaking, we always print the value or do a count or whatever to see what it is. You can just open up the variables, give it a second to load, and that'll show you all of your variables there. So I like that a lot as well. All right, this job is executing. And so what's going to happen here in a minute is we're going to be able to go to my training output folder, which this is cool, right? If you were doing this in Databricks and writing to your data lake, what would you have to do? You'd have to leave Databricks, go back to the Azure portal, go find your storage account, or you can go to Storage Explorer, go find it, go into it and see if it worked. But because all of these technologies are integrated together in my workspace, I can just go over to the Data Hub, go to linked, and then I can see the files right there. I can see if it worked. I love that capability of not having to go all over the place. Just a really cool thing. And so this is still running. Once again, it's 100 million rows of data. I have a really small Spark pool, so probably not the best choice for that. I think it takes about 2 minutes. But when it's done, we can come over to our Data Hub, go into linked. It's already open right here, by the way. And then I can go into training. It's going to click right here on this tab that was already open. And I'm going to go back to training, and I'm going to go to training output this time. So I'm just kind of switching that up. Here's the partition data folder. So it just got created 12:03. Means we got a break coming up in about 15 minutes. So stick with me here. And we're going to go into that, and then I got all of these folders created. Pretty cool, right? All right. So I'm going to come back over to the notebook. Let's see if it's done. It's done. It's succeeded. It took right at almost 2 minutes. And this is awesome. So now, watch this. We go over to our folder. Now, all of my data is partitioned by month. Pretty cool. Pretty easy to do by integrating a notebook, right? So I'm not a notebook guy, right? Just full transparency. I do training on it from time to time. I do some stuff with it, but that's not my core technology, right? I've told you that before. You go look at my YouTube videos, my blogs, you'll figure that out. But I do use it from time to time because I find this to be highly convenient, this integration. Now, if I go into pick up month, we're going to kind of wrap this up full circle here. I can come in here and right click on this file, do new SQL script, select top 100, right? And you'll notice that I can come over here. I'm doing pickup month equals 1. I'm going to go ahead and put a wildcard in here so we read all of the files that are in that folder again, just like we've done before. And I'm going to go ahead and run this against my master database on my serverless compute. And I'm going to click run. And then when it's done, we're going to go back over to monitoring and we're going to see how much data was read. All right. There we go. We've returned everything. Of course, we could do aggregations here. We could write it. We're going to go back over to the monitor hub real quick. And then right here, you'll notice that with that query that I just ran, it took 3 seconds and it was 10 megabytes of data processed. By the way, something you should know, serverless queries always do a minimum of 10 megabytes. So even if that was a 5 kilobyte query, it's going to be 10 megabytes. Once again, that cost is 0.000005. So it's very, very small, fractions on the penny. But there is a default that shows up there. All right. And then you can look at the query, but this gives me exactly what I wanted. I am getting partition elimination. I'm not reading all 100 million rows to return the month of January. I'm only reading the data I need to read, improving performance and minimizing cost, right? All right. So that's a way of just integrating notebooks into that. I've had a lot of fun learning notebooks, doing different things that I used to do in Databricks inside of Synapse notebooks, but very intuitive. And what I want to point out once again as we go through this class is the integration between these different services and how easily they kind of communicate and interact with one another. All right, so that is notebooks. Let me kind of glance at my notes and make sure I'm not missing something there. All right, so let's do this demo real quick. I'm going to show you something else. And some things I'm going to have to choose based on time. We've been doing a query against our data lake using this open row set syntax, right? And open row set is just not the most intuitive. Who wants to type out their storage account name and the file and all of that every single time? So what we could do is we could actually create an external table, which is it's not a real table that stores data, but we could create an external table that stores all the metadata information about the underlying files. And then we can query the regular external table as if it were a real table in a database. So I could say select top 100 star from taxi data, right? How do we do that? I'm going to walk you through that because this is cool. This makes it easier to write queries against your tables. It's more intuitive. Also, when you connect from Power BI, Power BI is going to recognize those tables, so you can connect and use serverless directly against using Power BI against Data Lake as well, and it becomes a little bit more intuitive and easier there as well. So let me kind of walk you through this real quick. The first thing we need to do is build a serverless database. This is super easy. So if I go over to the Data Hub and go back to Workspace right here, I can click on the plus button to add a new resource, and I'm going to tell it right here I want to create a SQL database. This is a dedicated or a serverless pool. This is not a regular Azure SQL database, so do not get that confused. But I want to create a serverless pool. So I'm going to click right here on the Data Hub, click the plus button to open that up. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to choose between serverless and dedicated. And then I'm going to choose serverless, of course, because that's what we're doing. And I'm going to call this my serverless, and it's my serverless pool, so I'll go with P1. All right, serverless P1. And then we'll go ahead and click create, and it's done. So that happens super fast. Now I have a database, and with the database, I can now load tables on that. I can create tables. We're going to create an external table that is, once again, it's just a metadata structure on top of the underlying files. All right, so let's do this real quick, and then Peter, I saw something from you. I'll take a look at that here in just a moment. All right, so let's create an external table. Now we could write syntax here. I could say create external table, create the file format, create these different things, but that's a lot of work. So there's an easier way to do it, as you can imagine. So if I wanted to create an external table on, let's say, pick up month 1, I can do that. So we're going to go back over to our data lake. Once again, really nice, really cool that we can do that. And I'm going to right click on one of these files here. And then I'm going to say new SQL script, and I'm going to say create an external table. So it's going to actually give me a UI and generate the script for me so I don't have to write it. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a new external table here. All right. This right here is my serverless P1 database. That's where I want to put it. And I'm just going to call this one taxi data. And then I'm going to say use a SQL script so we can read the script together and kind of look at what's happening there. And then we'll click create. All right. So there's a couple of things that are happening here. First, you have to create essentially a file format. And this file format is just going to be my Parquet file. And then that's going to be used in the create external table script. And then you also have to create an external data source here. And the data source that we're creating is just going to point to our data lake and that primary container. So super easy. Once it's created the first time, you really don't have to create it again. You can use that same file format and you can use that same data source for other scripts that you run whenever you're creating external tables, right? So we're going to go ahead and take advantage of these. I don't like this name though. So let me see if I can change this to something easier here. I'll call this ADLS primary or something because I'm going to use that later, I think. And then this one, I'm going to change to Parquet. I'm going to give it a more intuitive, easier name here. I do, because I'm changing those, I will have to come down here and change it down here. So that's Parquet, and that was, see this name? I don't want to have to type that every time. So that was ADLS primary. There we go. And then this one was Parquet. All right. So what this is going to do is this is going to create an external table, which is just the metadata on top of the file. It's not loading any data, right? This is not like loading a data into a dedicated pool. This is just the metadata on top of those files. And then I'm going to be reading the data from this exact location. Now I can change this, right? I don't want to just get that one file. I want to get everything from that file. Also, let's just get everything. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to do star. And then I'm going to do star. So grab within the partition data, grab all the folders, and within those folders, grab all the files. All right. So this is going to get everything, not just pick up month of 1. And then when I'm done, go ahead and select top 100 here. All right. Built in, serverless, script looks good. Let's go ahead and run that. And then let me look at what Peter was saying. All right, we got a couple of them. I'm still unsure about how this adds value over using ADF to push data to my Azure SQL database. So because Azure SQL Database, Peter, is not built in, and you don't have to apologize to me. I didn't develop it, right? I just work with it. Because Azure SQL Database is not something that we can yet link directly in here and intuitively work with, you still have to essentially go to Management Studio or go back to the Azure portal. I get exactly what you're saying. Like, I get that, right? But if you're using the data lake and you want to just create data sets, or you quickly want to be able to see what was written without having to go somewhere else, that definitely adds some pretty good value. To my knowledge, there's no goal right now for Microsoft to really deprecate Azure Data Factory. Right? I'm sure they would love to not have to manage 2 code bases, but I don't know of any plans to deprecate it. So I don't see any problem with being in Data Factory, but if I don't need any feature specifically that's in Data Factory, like SSIS integration runtime, lift and shift, then if there's no real reason for me to be there, I probably would just go with Synapse, because long term I would imagine they're gonna add more capabilities in here, more integrations that's gonna make it cleaner. So that might be a good reason just to plan for that. But that's just me thinking out loud. We got another question here. Using Notebook and generating partition data, aren't you paying for the increased duplicated storage? Yes, you are. The same way as if you were copying data using a pipeline. So that's a great question. If I were going to take old archive data, historical data, create a copy of it in a partitioned format, then I would go back and get rid of the old data, right? Because now it's all loaded. So once I verify it's all been loaded, yeah, go ahead and get rid of the old data, because yes, you would be paying for it. All right, so watch this right here. Here's what we're going to do. We've just created this table. Now, if I want to query data from my data lake, from Taxi Data, instead of doing this, let's go back one. Instead of doing this, or even further back, where we have to use open row set and we're querying all the data and doing a where clause, now I can do this. I can say select star, or let's do top 100. Let's do select top 100 star from, whoops, I did shift enter, my fault. I always do that. From Taxi Data. Make sure I'm pointing to serverless here, because I got to point to my database now. And now, instead of having to type open row set, right, I just query the table directly. Now, the table doesn't have anything in it. It's just a structure on top of the data that's in my data lake, but it makes it a lot easier to query. So if I highlight just this piece of code and I run it, we're going to get the top 100 rows from the Taxi Data. There it is. So we're back to just simplify. So you see how it simplifies it, right? And then of course, you could start trying to join tables together. These tables are going to show up in Power BI Desktop. We're obviously not going to dive that deep. Once again, if you want to dive deep into that, you want to take one of our boot camps where we really dive into all this. But this is where you can take advantage of external tables. All right. So this is going to be a great time to actually take a quick 15-minute break. Let me make sure, looking at my notes, that that's where I want to end. I think it is. That puts us in a great spot. Lots of great questions, lots of interactivity. We're going to take a 15-minute break, give you a chance to stretch your legs, and I'm going to read through some of the questions on break and see what we can answer as soon as we get back. And then we're now going to transition into talking about pipelines, data flows, as well as Power BI integration. Maybe a little bit more here. There's one more demo I'm going to think about, but I'm going to look at time, all right? I'll see you guys back here in 15 minutes. Enjoy your quick break. All right, welcome back everybody. Hopefully you had a good quick break there. I'm going to jump in real quick, and before we get started back up, I want to talk about our on-demand learning. Obviously, it's a very cost-effective way of staying up to date with the latest technology. When I first started working for Pragmatic Works about 9 years ago, a little over that, I was lucky to work with a guy by the name of Anthony Martin. Love that dude, super smart. But one of the things I learned from him in the 2 years we were working really closely together on a project is every morning he would spend 30 minutes before his day started reading blogs, reading articles, reading books, watching videos, whatever it was, just staying relevant, like just keeping his skills fresh. And that was one of the things I picked up from him, which I'm glad I did, because today's world, technology is changing so fast. There's so many new things, and you really have to work to keep up with technology, right? Well, for less than $1 a day, so grab yourself a cup of coffee, buy our training. You can keep yourself relevant with structured training that is designed specifically for you. And so anytime we do these events, we have, usually I think on every event so far, we have these big deals where you can really save a lot of money on our on-demand learning. And so I would definitely recommend that you take advantage of that. It ends on Sunday, right? So sign up for it. If you're watching this video recorded on YouTube, sorry, it's probably not $247 a day. All right, so we're going to dive right back in, and what we're going to be taking a look at now is ETL in Synapse. We're going to be taking a look at ETL. This is going to be, for those of you with a data factory background, very similar. Now, my goal here is to kind of highlight the integration that exists in Synapse Analytics that we don't necessarily get in Data Factory, but I get and I understand that a lot of people on here are probably like, hey, what's going on with Azure? So you want to learn a little bit about what a pipeline is and what a data flow is. And so I'm going to try to balance the two as we work through this. And so we're going to go through pipelines, data flows, and then we're going to get into the Power BI integration to kind of round off the day. All right, so let's do it. We're going to jump right in. We're going to cover the fundamentals here. Synapse resources, pipelines, data flows, data sets, linked services. These are the different resources that we use inside of Azure Synapse Analytics to build our pipelines and really to clean and transform that data. Data flows being the really transformation tool that we have available to us. Within a pipeline, we have activities, right? An activity essentially defines what action we want to perform on our data. Copy the data, run a stored procedure, run some kind of web activity, whatever it might be, run a notebook, run a Databricks notebook, right? So we can perform activities within a pipeline. And a pipeline is very similar to like an SSIS package. It is our orchestration tool where we control the flow. This runs, then this runs, then that runs, right? We can control the flow of the kind of order of operations there. And so you'll see that there are tons of different activities that are available within ASA and within Data Factory pipelines. Now, the copy activity is probably going to be the most common that you use. A lot of times we're going to want to copy data from different data stores, Dynamics, SharePoint or on-prem, and we want to get that data into maybe our data lake. We want to get it into our dedicated pool. We want to get it into our SQL database. In fact, one of the questions that I did see was, can we use a notebook inside of Synapse Analytics to write data to a SQL database? Of course you can. Yeah, it's not as intuitive and as easy as it was to write data to the data lake, because the data lake and the notebook are talking to one another. They're in the same workspace. It's integrated together. It just works. You don't have to pass in a bunch of credentials and all that to get it to write to the data lake, because it's all kind of communicating within that workspace, right? So with the database, you'd have to provide all the credentials and stuff, but yes, you can absolutely write to it. And then we could, of course, use copy activity within a pipeline to do the same thing. And so we can write to whatever data stores are available within our Synapse environment. There's the get metadata activity. If you followed any of my YouTube videos, you know I probably have 3 or 4 videos that highlight this activity. This activity has a lot of really cool things you can do, like get a list of all the files from a container, check to see if a file exists, and then loop over it with an until activity, waiting until the file does exist. So lots of cool capabilities that you can do with this. The hardest thing that people really struggle with, I think, right from the beginning with pipelines is, how do I read the activity output? So I have an output, I have an activity, it's outputting information. How do I read that? How do I use it in other activities? And so that's where a lot of my YouTube videos and our training that we do, our boot camps and stuff, really focus on dynamic, expressions and parameters and all that kind of stuff. Stored procedure activity, you use this to essentially invoke and run a stored procedure. The limitation with this is that stored procedure activities in pipelines in Synapse and Data Factory do not allow you to output parameters. Now, maybe that's changed, right? In the years that I've been working with it, it didn't. I don't even try anymore. So if somebody's figured out a workaround or whatever, then maybe it's changed. But in my experience, it doesn't allow you to do that. And then, of course, you're limited to those data sources, the SQL database, data warehouse, and the SQL Server database. If you want to run a stored procedure and you want to output values from it, you use the lookup activity. So you can use the lookup activity to retrieve a data set and return it to your pipeline in either Synapse or Data Factory. This can be any Data Factory source. You can execute stored procedures. You can run and execute SQL scripts. You do get the output parameters, and those can be either a scalar value or those can be an array or a list. All right, so that's going to be the lookup activity. And then, of course, we have the execute pipeline. This has a lot of applications, just so many different use cases here, some workarounds and different things you can do. But this allows us to build out that parent-child design pattern that so many of us are used to doing, right? Back in SSIS, back in whatever ETL tool of our choice, we kind of compartmentalize the code a little bit to make it reusable, which is even easier to do in pipelines than it was with on-prem like SSIS. To make that code more dynamic and reusable across multiple files, multiple tables, you get the work that needs to be done in the parent, you pass the parameters into the child and dynamically change the tables and change the files that you're processing. So execute pipeline, really, really cool activity here. And then, of course, we have the for each activity. This allows you to, in the pipeline, I like to think of the pipeline kind of like a control flow in SSIS. In the pipeline, you can take the for each activity and loop over an array or a list, processing each item in that list, one item at a time. And then you can perform a set of activities for each item. So grab the first file, write that information to a database, copy the file, archive the file, update the audit table saying it was done, and then go get the next file and do the same set of activities again. So very simple. You've probably used it in SSIS or in SQL or .NET, right? Everybody on this call has probably used some version of a for each in some technology. The filter activity in the control flow takes an array. So maybe you use the get metadata activity to get a list of all the objects in a container. Then you use the filter activity to filter it down to just the files you want. So that will take an array, filter it down based on an expression, and then it outputs its own array, a separate array that can be used in your pipeline. Now, the one thing that we need to be aware of when we're working inside of Synapse Analytics is kind of creating those different objects that we need. Creating connection managers / link services. So if you've worked with SSIS or on-prem SQL Server, we called it connection managers. Well, in the cloud, inside of Synapse and Data Factory, those same connection managers are called link services. This stores the connection information, and this stores the credentials for that information here. And then we have integration runtimes. I'm not going to dive into that here in this 3-hour workshop, but integration runtimes essentially are the compute, the CPU, the I/O, the memory that is used to move the data, to perform the different activities that you do within your pipeline, right? So that's how you get charged. Once again, just like you saw with serverless on demand, if you're not doing a lot of crazy stuff in there, a lot of times it's going to be pennies on the dollar. It's super cheap to run these pipelines, but I'm going to show you where you can go into the monitoring and actually look and get an idea of the cost of these pipelines as well. So all this integration that we get inside of Synapse, we're going to take a look at. All right. We can use, and I would recommend, you can use folders within your environment to try to organize it, right? So I don't know what the suggestion would be. I kind of wish there was a better way to organize it than just folders. But on-prem, you'd create a solution and you'd have projects within that solution. And so you might have 3 different SSIS projects that had different purposes, but they were all in the same solution, but they were very separate and very distinct. Here, we're using folders. Nothing wrong with that, but that is how you kind of organize it if you're working inside of Synapse. And so a lot of times when I'm doing training for a private customer and all the students are working in the same environment, I have them create their own folder with their name. In production, you'd probably have this broken down by like department or different projects that you're on, right? So it could be a little bit different the way that we set that up, but folders are the way that we organize really inside of Synapse Analytics and Data Factory. Now, link services define the connection information so that Data Factory or Synapse can connect to the data source. Those link services and those data sets that we create, the pipelines, the data flows, all the objects and artifacts that we create are globally available to other pipelines and data flows, right? So it's not like SSI. I'm going to keep making comparisons to SSIS, okay? I know most of us have that background. It's not like integration services on-prem where you could build a data set that was scoped to just that package, right? You don't scope things to just a pipeline in Synapse Analytics. They're globally available to all of your other objects, which is a great thing because it makes them more reusable. And we need to think about that. How do we parameterize this? Do we import the schema? Do we not, right? We're getting into a little bit more intermediate stuff here. But we think about that because a lot of times we start building pipelines, building data flows, building data sets, and we hard code everything. Then we start to realize, wait a minute, too far down the road, probably I could have parameterized all this and I could have used one data set in place of 30. So Data Factory is very powerful. Synapse Pipeline is very powerful with that kind of reusability and dynamic capability that we get. All right, so that was kind of the basics of pipelines. I think next is data flows, so we'll come back to that. What I want to do is dive back into Azure Synapse Analytics, and let's build a simple pipeline. I'm going to build a simple pipeline that loads a table in our dedicated pool, right? Now, normally what we would do, the step one, is we need to make sure that we have connection managers here. So I'm going to go over here to my Manage Hub right here, and I'm going to go over to Link Services. This is where you create new connection managers, and you'll notice that I currently have 2 connection managers. These connection managers were created for me when I provisioned my ASA environment. The first one points to my ASA, my Azure Synapse Analytics workspace. So that's the server, and then I can put in the name of the database because you could have more than one database. So the database is parameterized, so that works for all of my databases on this server. The other link service that was created is actually pointing to my data lake. Remember, when you provision Azure Synapse Analytics, you have to give it a primary data lake so it knows what the data lake is, and it goes ahead and it creates that link service for you. So we can leverage what's already there. However, if you were working in here and you wanted to connect to your SQL database, that was a question we had earlier, what I would do is I'd come in and click New up here at the top, and I'd create a new connection. And then over here, we're going to circle back to Power BI in just a little bit. Over here, you can look through all the different connections that are available, right? So if you want to connect to any of these, create a connection manager and pull back data from any of these different connections, you can. You just walk through the process. So if I were connecting to, SQL database, I would grab Azure SQL database here, I can click it twice, give it a name, and then I would come down here and I could enter it manually if I want. And I would say, hey, my database is Pragmatic Works Public. Oh, I'm not typing it. Oh, there I am. Pragmatic Works, it's delayed. .database.windows.net. I could type out the server, type out the database name, put in my credentials, test connection, and create that connection. Now, that doesn't connect me to a specific table or a specific view or a specific stored procedure, right? It connects me to the database. So that is the link service. Now, within a link service, we have data sets. So for this example that I'm going to do, we already have 2 link services that have been created for us. So the next step is I want to connect to a specific file in my data lake, and I want to load that data to a specific table in my dedicated pool. So we need to create 2 data sets. Now for the first data set, we're going to take advantage of the integration that exists within Azure Synapse Analytics. Always coming back to integration. So I'm going to go over to the Data Hub, and from the Data Hub here, I'm going to go over to Linked. All right. And I could just go up here to the top. It's still open from before. So I'll go over to my file system. And let me think. For this example here, let's keep it with a smaller example. We'll do internet sales actually. So I'm going to go to training data. And in my training data here, I have an internet sales Parquet file. I'm going to right click on that. And this is going to be my source. I want to take the data that's sitting out there. It's sitting in my data lake. And I want to load it into my dedicated pool, right? So I'm going to do a new SQL script. Actually, I'm going to do a new data set. So I'm going to do a new integration data set, and this just makes it a little bit easier. Normally, I would have to go to this hub. I'd have to go to my data hub, click on new, click on new integration data set, and I'd have to walk through the process. Choose the data store, give it a name. This makes it just a little bit easier. So I'm going to click right there. That's going to open up a new window over here. And then I'm going to give this data set a name. So I'll say Azure. It's the data's in Azure. It's in my Azure Data Lake store. It's in my Azure Synapse. The name of the storage account is Azure Synapse Workshop. So I'm going to put that in there. And then the name of the file is Internet Sales. And that's the way I've always named all of them. No specific reason. I think it just helps me out a lot. I always put where the data is, on-prem, Azure, wherever it might be. That I put the provider type, the data store type, I put the name of it, and then I put, if it's a data set, the table name, the file name, the folder name, whatever that might be. I'm going to select my format. It's going to be a Parquet file. And then I could import the schema if I want, or I could not import the schema. Totally up to me. I'm going to go ahead and import the schema from the file that I'm connecting to. All right, and then I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So this makes it really easy just to create that data set without having to go through the normal process, and we're done. Now, you can always come back to the Data Hub, and you can go back in here and you can modify a data set. You can add additional data sets. You can do that anytime you want. If I come and look at this data set right here, I want to point out a couple of key features. All right, one, I talked about this before, you can parameterize these data sets. So I'm kind of hard coding it. And since I hard coded it, I went ahead and imported the schema. But if I were making this a dynamic data set that could really grab any file from my data lake, what I would do is I would come over here and I'd create a parameter. I'd give it a parameter like file name. And then I would map that file name parameter to this box right here. All right. Once again, I have YouTube videos on that, 3-hour workshop. We don't have time to dive that deep into one specific topic, but that's how you would do it. And then I would clear the schema because each file would have its own schema. So I'd clear that out to make this more dynamic. And this is what we call late arriving schema. The schema shows up at runtime. We don't know exactly what it's going to be, but Data Factory and Synapse is incredible at being able to work with that. Whereas, other tools we've used in the past, legacy tools like SSIS, really were so metadata rigid. We couldn't do that, not easily. So this is pretty cool stuff, but we're going to go with the connection here. That's good. All right, number one. The next thing we need to do is build a data set for the table we want to load. So I'm going to go, and this time we are going to walk through the normal steps. I'll go up to the top. By the way, I should have published a long time ago. I normally would never let this get beyond like 1 or 2. So be very careful with this because you are working in a web development environment. If if this crashes or something happens, you're losing all your notebooks, all your scripts. There's no auto recovery here. So make sure you publish and save your work early and often. Don't do like me. All right. So I'm going to go up here to the top. Let me go right here. I'm going to click right here on integration data sets, and we're going to create a new integration data set. And this time I want to connect to Synapse Analytics, specifically to my dedicated pool. So we'll go to Synapse Analytics right there. And then I'll click on it again to go to the next screen. And then I'll give this a name. This is going to be Azure again. The data source is in Azure. It's a SQL pool, so I'll type that out. And then the database name is my dedicated P1, my dedicated pool 1. And then the table I'm connecting to is going to be, let's just call it my sales table. All right. I'm going to choose my link service real quick right here. So that was the one that was created for me when I provisioned Azure Synapse Analytics. And then the table doesn't exist yet. So I can't really choose one from the dropdown because I haven't created it. So I'm going to let the pipeline create the table for me at runtime. So another capability here for making this dynamic. If you had 100 files you had to process that all needed to go into 100 different tables, can you set that all up to be dynamic and automatically create the tables? The answer is yes. And of course, we've had customers that have had that need, and Data Factory Synapse handles it really, really well. So I'm going to give this a name. We'll call this DBO, Internet Sales. All right. I don't know if we just don't have a lot of questions, but I haven't seen the chat over here from Matt really popping anything new. So either I messed it up or we don't have any questions here. That's kind of odd. And then we'll call it Internet Sales. That's fine. Now, I don't want to import the schema because I can't really import the columns and import the data types when the table doesn't exist yet. So we have to go with none. And then we'll go ahead and go back down to the bottom and click OK. All right. And so now we have created data set number 2. So we've created 2 data sets here. One that connects to my internet sales file, one that connects to the table I want to load data into, doesn't yet create. or it doesn't yet exist. And so now I want to create a pipeline that moves that data. But before I go any further, I'm thinking back right now in my head to when I did a 3-hour presentation on DAX and my model crashed on me right before we went on break. And I did not save it, and that was a lot of problems. So I'm going to go ahead and publish everything that I've done so far so that if something were to happen, I do not lose the work that we've done. Now there's one more thing we have to do with this data set. We're not done with the data set. Because this data set, that connection manager, was parameterized, we actually have to tell it, watch this. So on this data set right here, Azure SQL Pool Dedicated P1, we have to tell it what database we're connecting to. So that's the only thing with this one, because it's parameterized. You could use any database on this server. You have to tell it which one. So I believe I named mine Dedicated P1. I'm going to check though. We're going to go back over to Workspace. Yeah, that's it. All right. So we give it a database name since we use the default that was provisioned at runtime. And then that's it for my data sets. Now, we're going to build a very simple pipeline real quick. I'm going to show you how to copy data, how to, through the process of copying data, automatically create a table. And that's going to generate quite a bit of conversation around SQL pools. So, as you can imagine, if we want to build a pipeline, we're going to go right over here to the iconography that kind of represents a pipeline, which is the integrate hub. And from there, we're going to create a new pipeline. All right. And then I'm going to give this pipeline a name. I'll give it something very simple like load internet cells. Let me get my face off the screen there. We'll call this one load internet cells. All right. And then we'll go ahead and remove the properties to close that up. By the way, there's been a really odd bug with Synapse where it seems to do this. It seems to cut off half of the screen like this, and you can't see this half of the screen. You can't save, you can't publish. It is not an awesome experience. And so I figured out a workaround on that bug. If you click on the code view right here, you flip to the code and you flip back, it fixes it. So if you come across that problem, that is the workaround. Because I'm teaching this so often, I'm with a bunch of different students who, I'm like, man, it's unfortunate to tell somebody refresh the web page and start over. But I figured out if I click that button specifically and I come back, it kind of refreshes the view. So that's extra, that's free, no charge. All right, so moving on. And it's been happening sporadic. It's happened to me a few times. I know it's happened to Matt, who's on the call as well. So it does seem to be some oddity there. Maybe it's with my browser. I'm using Chrome. I don't know, but there you go. All right, so let's build a pipeline. We've created a new pipeline. When you create a new pipeline, you're going to get a list of all of the activities over here on the left that are available for the pipeline. Once again, if you've been in Data Factory, look, the feel, the experience is the same, right? I'm going to go in here though, and under Move and Transform, this is where I can copy data. We're going to pull in the copy data activity, and we're going to set that up by simply saying, look, take the data from the source, drop that data into the destination. And then Derek has a question here, so I know that the chat is still working. Are you able to comment on how Azure Synapse pipelines compare with Informatica pipelines? That is one thing that I actually cannot comment on. I don't know much about Informatica. My experience with Informatica was probably 6 or 7 years ago when it was on-prem, and we were trying to move customers off of that to SSIS, and we were trying to build a software to do that automatically. So that's my limitation with it. I don't know anything about Informatica. Never worked with it other than that. So how they compare, performance, cost, I have no idea, unfortunately. Good question, though. All right. Maybe. Remember, I'm going to do a Q&A after this is over, so I'll do some research on that, Derek, and see if there's some resources out there that I can talk to in the video afterwards. So I would love to respond to that. Just right now at this moment, that's not something I can give any kind of context on. All right, so with the copy activity, we're going to go ahead and set this up real quick. Now, if you've never been in here before, I'm going to be going probably a little too fast, but I will try to explain things as I go. When I click on this activity, it's going to give me the properties window at the bottom. And I see that I have two required parameters, one that's in the source and one that is going to be in the sink, right? So I have to identify what is my source data set, what is my destination data set, where am I reading data from, where am I writing data to? And so I'm going to go ahead and click on source, and then I'm going to point right here. I'm going to point to the Azure Data Lake right here and my internet cells file. That's going to be the first thing. Now you're going to notice when you click on it, lots of options appear. It can be a little bit overwhelming. But these are a lot of really good options in here. So you could say, hey, just take the file path that's in the data set. Or I know that I'm pointing to a specific file, but you know what? I changed my mind. Let's just use a wildcard here and let's go and look for a specific, a folder that matches a specific criteria or files. So you can use that same data set from before, and you can add a wildcard to it. So you can definitely do that. You can also add in the name of the file down here with additional columns. We won't get into that. So there's a lot of extra capabilities that exist within here. Under the sync destination, I'm going to go ahead and switch this over to my SQL pool. Specifically, I want to load the data into that sales table that doesn't yet exist. And so I'm going to grab that right there. And then I have to choose a couple of things here. And I'm going to choose, what type of copy method do I want to use? When you're loading dedicated SQL pool, if you have some history with massive parallel processing with PDW or when it was Azure SQL Data Warehouse, for the longest time, it's always been use Polybase because Polybase takes advantage of that MPP architecture and it's able to parallelize out the inserting of data and loading that data, right? But we now have something called the copy command, which I personally prefer. It's a lot cleaner, a lot easier. It handles null better. It handles when columns get moved in and out, it handles that a little bit better. It doesn't have the row limitations that Polybase does. So generally, I prefer the copy command. However, in this instance, I am going to use Polybase. And the reason for that is the copy command, one of the limitations is that you cannot use like create table as select. And so when you're creating a new table, copy command is not the right way to go. That's kind of like the one con that I can think of off the top of my head. So if I try to do auto create this table that doesn't exist, copy command will not work. So I'm going to switch this over to Polybase, and we're going to use the Polybase method here. And then we are going to click right here on auto create table to create the table in my dedicated pool. If it does not exist, if it already exists, this will not create it, right? If it exists, it's just going to load it. And the information over here probably talks to exactly that. The pre-copy script is pretty cool. So for example, I could come in here and say, truncate table, internet cells. Whoops, there we go. We could truncate the table. If I wanted, I could actually drop table, internet cells. I'll drop it and it'll get recreated every time because we already know auto creation would do that. That happens before this activity runs. It's a pre-copy script. So there are different things you can do here that are pretty cool. And then I think, just because of time, I'm not going to dive too much deeper into this. For mapping, I'm going to let it just do auto mapping, right? We're taking advantage of that late arriving schema where we don't have to force the mapping. It gives us that flexibility and that dynamic capability. And so I'm going to run this. There's a couple ways I can run this. Let me talk about this real quick. I'm going to add a little bit extra in here. So I could run this in debug. What debug says is I want to run the latest version of this pipeline right here inside of Azure Synapse Analytics. Not what's been published, but the latest version right here. If I run it from a trigger and I click right here and I say trigger now, that's going to run the latest version of this pipeline that's been saved to Synapse Analytics, which right now is none because we haven't published it at all. So it wouldn't run anything, right? I like debug when I'm working here because I can get the output right here. I can see it in the pipeline without having to go to the monitoring hub, and I can kind of test things out. The other benefit of debug, I told you I'm going to add something new in here, is you can use breakpoints with debug. So very similar to SSIS. Remember in SSIS how you could disable task in your control flow? Well, you use breakpoints to do that here. Watch this. If I go and grab the general category and I grab, let's say, the wait activity, because we don't have to set it up and configure it. So I'm going to grab that and then I'll grab another one. So if I have a couple of extra, pretend like these are actually doing something. But if I have these wait activities in here and I do something like add a precedent constraint. So if this runs successfully, then run this. And then I'm going to add, just for the video here, I'm going to say if this fails, run this other thing. So if it fails, we're going to drag that over. So that's on the recording for you. And so now if this runs successfully, it's going to run this one. If this runs and it fails, it runs this one. Let's say that this pipeline has been failing. And it's been failing on this activity right here. And so this activity only takes, let's say, 30 seconds to run. But if it runs successfully, this activity takes like 2 hours to run. And I'm trying to test this out. I'm trying to fix this. So I don't want to run this pipeline that runs in 30 seconds and then the other activity runs for 2 hours, right? I don't want to do that. So what I can do is click this nice little red button right here that most people completely ignore and pretend like doesn't exist. And that is a breakpoint. And what it means is I can now debug this and it will only run the activities up until that breakpoint and then it stops the pipeline. So I can test it out, right? I can test out this copy activity. I can make sure it's working. Then once I know it's working, I can deploy it again and I can run it in production. So if I hit debug, it's going to run the copy activity, but it will not run these. So that's another benefit of kind of that debug capability if you want to use that. Now, like I said before, immediately, as long as I don't have an activity selected, so I want to click in the background. If I click in the background, I can immediately see my output and I can wait for this to run. All right. So let's see here. I already did that one. Bond said, any idea of if Synapse will integrate with our programming language as well? I do not have any idea on that, but if you email me, Bonds, I can, and Matt will put my email in the chat window, I can reach out to somebody on the Microsoft team and find out for you, because I was actually bummed by that as well. So definitely reach out and let me know, and I'll find out what I can for you. All right, so I got an error message that actually was not planned. But I like error messages. I always like error messages because they show us how to debug, right? So we're going to click right here on the bottom. I know that my pipeline is running. We used Polybase. Yes. So it should work. Let's see what happened. We're going to click on the error message. So we're going to click right here at the bottom on this activity. Let's find out why it failed. Oh, that is interesting. Is it a firewall rule? So let me zoom out real quick and read through this a little bit quicker. So database, check the link services connect to make sure. Cannot connect to Azure Workshop. So yes. So this is because I locked down my server and I locked it to only my computer. When it's trying to do this load operation, it's trying to use essentially virtual machines in the background that don't have permission to connect. This is why I did a 30-minute video on managed virtual networks to get around this problem without enabling all your IP addresses. But the reason it's failing is because the virtual machine within Azure that's trying to do this operation, the integration runtime, it doesn't have permissions. It doesn't have the IP address. So I'm going to go back over here and I'm going to go into my resource group and I'm actually just going to turn on all IP addresses real quick. So let me go back over to resource groups and then we'll go into the workshop here and I'll go in here and I'm going to turn on that firewall rule. All right. And so let me do allow all. And then we're going to do 0.0.0.0. Terrible practice, but we're in the middle of a demo. We're going to make this happen. So 255 dot. Got it. All right. I'm going to add that in, save, and I'm just going to allow all IP addresses so this will run. So like I said, I put in mine and that did not get the job done. So that's going to take a minute to update. Apologies for that. I did not even think about that when I was applying that firewall rule because normally I set up a virtual network for that. Let's see. Still updating. All right. So that'll run when we come back. And remember what it's going to do. It's going to automatically create a table on our database. And to verify that, we're going to come over. We don't have to go. This is the nice integration. Again, I'm going to keep pointing to this. This is the nice integration capability of working inside of Synapse Analytics. I can just come over to the Data Hub. I can look at my dedicated pool right here and refresh it, and I'm going to be able to see that the database is there, or the table that I'm creating is there when we get done here in just a moment. Right now it's empty. We got to run it again. Let's see. It says it's updated the firewall rule. We're going to run this in debug again, and then we'll give that just a moment. Did it say it failed already? Oh, that's hopefully that's a few seconds ago. That was way too quick on the failure there. All right, one more time here. Debug, one more time. All right, I'm gonna save it and I'm gonna reload it real quick. Let's do this. Turn that off. We're gonna clean this up just a little bit. You gotta have at least one demo that goes bad in every presentation, apparently. It's a rule. There's an unwritten rule out there. And then let me close this thing up and we're gonna open it back up real quick because that doesn't even give us an error message. It says, it failed. All right, so this is from before. I'm gonna close all these other tabs, close that down again. Let's open it back up. All right, so I'm gonna run it from Synapse Analytics. I'm gonna run it live from Synapse Analytics. What is going on? Oh, the database name. Did that get removed? Let's see. So it's complaining that the database name is null. Remember in the data set we had to specify the name? And I thought I had, unless I reverted that. I apologize for a little derailment here. It's good to see the error message. I actually don't normally use the built-in link service that's created for Synapse. I don't like having to specify the date because you can type it in wrong. You can make mistakes, which is probably what I did. It's null. I typed it in earlier. All right, so dedicated P1. All right, interesting. All right, now we can run it again. So the error message actually was pretty good there. I just missed it. All right, so now it's gonna run. My apologies. I'm glad we did have that error message because it's good to see that. How do we debug? How do we look at the error messages? But a little bit unexpected. If you've been in any of my classes, you can attest to the fact that I always create a new link service and I don't use that one just because that one somehow it got removed, but you could accidentally forget to forget or put the wrong one in, right? Because you're typing it in plain text. It's not like you get a drop down. So I'm not a big fan of that, but let's refresh it. Should be done. It's done. So now with that integration in Synapse Analytics, we can go check right now our database without having to go to Management Studio, without having to go somewhere else. I can come right here under Workspace. I can refresh my database, and then I'm going to see that new table that we just created right there, Internet Sales. Pretty cool, right? So this is that integration that we're talking about. You can see the results right away in this unified development environment without having to go to all these different tabs like we do, or we did when we were doing all the different things in Azure, which was, a little frustrating to say the least, but this cleans that up a lot. All right, so that's a very simple pipeline. In this demo, we took a look at not just running the copy activity, right? We took a look at how to run the copy activity. We took a look at how to set up those precedent constraints. So we looked at, green as well as red if it fails. So you just set that up very easily right here by clicking right here. This is how you can add that kind of conditional logic on the orchestration of that pipeline. We took a look at breakpoints, even though it never actually ran because my database was null. So we fixed that. And then we had the firewall rule issue that I had to go fix. But I do not recommend doing what I just did. That is not a best practice. Go take a look at that video that I have on YouTube. It's like 30 minutes long. It talks about virtual networks and it talks about why you want to set that up. So that's a good place to go. But we're in a class, we got to get this done, right? So I went ahead and set that up real quick. And so this was a good little demo. Keep in mind that if you come down to general, and I'm going to go through a couple more activities and we're going to transition to data flows. If you come down here to general, there's a lot of other activities. And I have, our class that we do, our boot camp goes through practically all of these in depth. We show how they all interact, how to do, for each loops and dynamic capabilities, parameterization, expressions. We get into all of that. So if you really want to dive deep into all the different capabilities here, reach out to us. Once again, we'd love to do those trainings for your team. Now, we're going to transition over to data flows. And I have a couple of slides here, so I'm going to glance at them real quick and see if it's something that I want to do. Let me go ahead and flip over to that. And I realized that I did not show you on the screen those activities. I was on screen myself, so I've never made that mistake before, but today that's number 3. So strike number 3, I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to skip the PowerPoint. So the PowerPoint talks about data flows and the fact that the reason we have data flows is that they help us with transformation logic. This is where we can go to make sure that we transform the data, because you're really not going to transform data in a pipeline. A pipeline is for orchestration purposes, kind of setting up that workflow, what operates and what runs when, right? Another thing I want to point out in the pipeline real quick before we do move on is that if you go down to, let's find it right here. So I'm looking for notebooks. Where? Synapse, here it is. So under Synapse right here, you can pull in a notebook, and now you can just run that notebook that we created earlier, and it really doesn't take any kind of weird authentication. So if you've ever done this with Databricks, you got to go there, you got to generate a token, come back over here, create a connection manager, a link service, and then there's a couple little hoops that you have to jump through. And after you run your Databricks notebook, what do you have to do? If you want to see if it ran successfully or what happened, you got to go back over to your Databricks environment. But if you're working with notebooks, once again, integrated right here, using the same Apache Spark architecture in the background, if you're working with that, you run it, you come over to monitoring and you see, did it run? Did it fail? What happened, right? You can dive deeper into that after the fact. So it's another one of those just small little integration features that exist within Azure Synapse Analytics. All right, let me get rid of that. We're going to jump over here to data flows. So where do we build data flows? We do that inside the Develop Hub. Now, let me talk a little bit about data flows while I'm doing this. Data flows are everything you build in a data flow is going to be converted to Scala, and it's going to be ran against a Databricks cluster. So you're getting that capability, that scale out capability, that massive parallel processing that you get with Apache Spark. But in the background, you don't have to do this yourself. You don't have to spin up and provision a cluster, but you are going to get billed for that cluster for, however much data is used. It seems to be pretty cost effective in general, but this does need to be part of your consideration. Somebody asked that question earlier. They said, hey, what do you think about ETL, extract, transform, and load data versus extract data, load it, and then transform it after the fact, right? So do I take the data, use a pipeline, dump it in my pool, and then transform it, or dump it in my Azure SQL database and then transform it, because the dedicated pool and the database, we're kind of paying that flat rate if it's running all the time. We're paying that flat rate for that hour, whatever it is. So it's not really additional cost to me to transform the data there. But if I transform it here, it can have that additional cost, right? So you got to weigh that. What do you prefer? I like building out data flows, but if it's too cost prohibitive, I'm going to build it in a stored procedure, right? So something to absolutely consider. Let's create a new data flow here. Gives us this nice little pop-up. And I'm going to keep this very simple. I don't want to go too crazy with this. The first thing I want to do, though, is I want to turn on data flow debug. This data flow debug capability, I'm just going to click OK. This is actually going to spin up a small Databricks cluster for me that allows me to kind of preview the data right here in the data flow. Once again, this was not here when data flows first came out. I remember a painful experience of trying to learn stuff in here. So I love this capability, but I am going to get charged for this Databricks cluster, right? This pool that's running in the background. I'm going to get charged for that. It's small, it's not very expensive, but you will get charged for that. So don't leave it running. If you got 100 developers, everybody shouldn't have this on and running all the time. Just turn it on when you need it. But I want to show specific capability. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that you'll notice that when you create a data flow, you don't get a pane or a window box that shows you a list of all of the different transformations. So that's the first thing you'll notice is different between a pipeline and a data flow. That's different from a data flow here and a data flow back in SQL Server Integration Services. However, the first thing I'm going to do is choose my source, right? So I'm going to click right here in that little perforated box to choose my data source. And then down here at the bottom, let me go ahead and get off screen for a minute. Down here at the bottom, I can give this a name, and we're going to call this one Internet Sales. So we're going to pull data from Internet Sales table, and I'm going to walk through some of the different transformations and how to use them and that capability because it's pretty cool. I'm going to choose my data set. Now, if you remember, I've already created a data set that points to my Internet Sales data. So I'm going to reuse that because by reusing it, it saves time and it kind of still allows me to showcase the capabilities that I want to take a look at. All right. Now this part right here is actually kind of important. So let me move this over just a little bit so I can slide back in on the screen. Allow schema drift is where you say, hey, I know that if I define the schema might change. Columns might change, columns might get added, columns might get removed. And if they do change, I don't want this to fail because we're building this to be flexible and dynamic and to be responsive, right? We're building it to be responsive. However, if you say to yourself, I want this to be like SSIS, I want it to be metadata rigid, it can't change, that's okay. You can come down here to the bottom and you can click Validate Schema. So you really choose one or the other. I'm going to actually leave it as Allow Schema Drift. It's fine for what I'm doing. Now the next thing I want to do is come over to Source Options. And under Source Options, you'll notice that similar to a copy activity, you can override the default file with a wildcard path. So if you wanted to maybe grab specific files, if you had a bunch of files in there that had the date appended to them and you want to pass in like, star 2021 star and only grab those files, you could do something like that here. And then there's some other stuff. What column do you want to store the file name in? So I could say, hey, in my destination, I have the file name, so I want to bring that in from the original file. So I'm going to add that here, and then it will automatically get mapped. Also, another cool capability, you can archive the files immediately after processing them right here without having to add an additional activity in your pipeline. So normally we would, if we want to archive the data, we'd add like a copy activity and we could move it to like an archive folder, or we could delete it with like a delete activity, right? But you can do that as part of the data source. So that's pretty cool. Projection allows us to see all of the columns. You can always reset it, import projection if it's not here. And then really that's about it for the data source. Now, if I go to preview, you can preview the data. I'll highlight that capability on transforms in just a moment. So now, how do we add transforms? We've connected to internet sales. We're going to walk through about 4 or 5 transforms. Then we're going to jump and pivot over to Power BI. All right, we'll talk about that integration, which is pretty cool as well. So with internet sales here, I'm going to click on this plus button right here at the bottom right. And this is going to show me all of the transformations that are being run here. All right, and so if I go down and I look at all of the different transformations, I can see lookups, I can do conditional splits, I can do joins. You're going to see a lot of the same usual suspects that you're used to from SSIS on-prem. I could do derived column. That was one of my favorites. I use that all the time. And then there's a select column. That's an easy way to get rid of columns that have kind of worked their way in your data flow that you don't want. You can get rid of them. We can do an aggregate, a surrogate key, pivot, unpivot window. So let's do window function first, right? So if you got a background in SQL Server, right? Window functions, when I was writing SQL, I don't write a lot of SQL anymore, right? That's your career changes over time, so I don't get to write it as much as I used to. But I used to love window functions, row number functions, rank, the aggregate functions that were window functions. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do an aggregate function. So here's the deal. I have all of these transactions, and on each transaction we have product, we have customer, and we have the date. And I want to find out my total sales for each product. But I don't want to group by product key. I want to keep the original detailed data, and I want to aggregate the product for that product that's in that one, right? So I'm going to create a window function that does that. So I'm going to bring in the window function. Let me show you how easy this is to do. And I'm going to tell it the incoming stream is internet sales. Perfect. Let's call this aggregate by product. And then the over clause is really kind of like your group by clause. And so I'm going to say, get the sum of sales amount over the product key. So get a list of all the product keys, all the transactions, and get a sum across all of those, right? So I'm going to do that right here. And I'm just going to grab product key, just like that. And then I'm going to go over and we're going to go over to our window columns. And this is where I'm going to add in my aggregation. So I'll call this something like total sales by product. And then, if you haven't ever seen this before, we're now going to dive into the expression editor. The expression editor, the list of functions and capabilities inside of data flows is very rich. Very rich, lots of functions, lots of capabilities. And so you're going to see that now. So I'm going to click in the box. When I click in the box, it gives me the pop-up just below. And then I'm going to go ahead and click right there in that expression builder. All right. Now, I'm going to go ahead and write a very basic, very simple aggregation, right? I just want to do a sum. What I can do is I can filter over here, so I can click on functions. You'll notice when I go to functions, there are a lot of functions. There are hundreds of them out here. I've never counted them, but it feels like hundreds. There's a lot of functions out here. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to filter this down to sum. So I know that I probably want to do an aggregation of just a sum. There it is right there. I'm going to click sum. It adds it to the expression editor. And then I'm going to choose the column that I want to sum. And I can do that by coming to the input schema. So I'll remove my filter. And then I'm going to search for sales amounts. There it is. And there it is. So very simple. Sum, sales amount. Now, if you wanted to add additional aggregations, like count the number of rows or whatever, you could create new columns from right here. So I could click create new. I'm not going to, but you could. All right, so you don't have to close and come back and close and come back. You can just add those right there. I'm going to hit save and finish. And then real quick, so we can see the result, I'm going to come over to data preview. And I'm going to preview the results of that, right? So back in the day, when data flows first came out, you'd have to come in here and you'd build your data flow. You'd run the data flow from a pipeline. You'd have to wait 6 or 7 minutes for it to run because it would take about 5 or 6 minutes to provision the Databricks cluster. It would fail on something super minor, and then you'd come back, try to fix it, run it again, wait 6 or 7 minutes. It fell again. It would drive you absolutely insane. But now with Dataflow Debug, you can kind of test it out and make sure it's working. I love this capability because I remember when it wasn't available. Now I have my very detailed information, granular information, but if I scroll all the way over to the very, very right, I can see, oops, wrong button, hit escape, it's not a break, no break. I can see right here that for a product of 310, because that's the row I'm on, we had 586,000 in sales. Now, if I'm lucky, we might get a different product here to see the difference. Well, we're not lucky. It's not in the top 100. But we're going to see it in a minute because I'm going to show you the aggregate function in contrast to this. So that's pretty cool, using window functions here, just like we did, in SQL, kind of that aggregate over clause. I'm going to go ahead and delete this though, since we've seen what the window function does. And now we're going to take a look at the aggregate function. And for 310, it was like 586,000. So we'll see if it matches up. All right, so I'm going to add a new transform again. This time we're just going to do the aggregate, and I'm going to aggregate the data by product key. This time we don't get all 26 columns, 27 columns. We only get the columns that are part of that aggregate, right? Just like writing a select statement in SQL, whatever's in the select statement, whatever you're grouping by, whatever you're doing an aggregation on, that's all that shows up in the final result set. So we're going to go from 26 columns down to 2. I'm going to group by product key. So now product key only shows up in the final result set one time, and that name is fine. Then we're going to switch over to aggregate, and I'm going to create a total sales column just like we did before. You can, well, not here, never mind. We're going to do total sales. I'll talk about that other part later. Click on enter expression and then go into the expression builder. All right. All right, and then I'm going to come in here and say sum, and we're going to sum this up by sales amount. Does it pop up for me? No. All right, I'm going to come down to input schema, and we'll do the same thing we did before, just like that. All right, and then we'll click save and finish. So the exact same thing I did with the window function, sum sales amount. Super easy. And now we can come over here and let's preview the data again. All right. So we should get a list of all of our products, one row per product, and what the aggregated total was. And you'll see for product of 310, it's around 586,000. So we can see that the window function was working perfect, exactly the way we wanted it to. It gave us all the detailed rows with the aggregate. But then we looked at it and said, look, that's not really what we want. Let's get rid of it. Let's bring in the aggregate function. All right, let's build on this. We're going to try out and just test out a couple of different transformations. So the next thing I want to do is let's do a rank function. Actually, let's add to this. So if I wanted, I could add total transactions too, right? So inside of this transformation, I can click the little plus button right here, and I can add additional columns to my aggregate. So I'm going to add in something here like total transactions. Move my mouse out of the way. All right. And then over here for the expression, I'm going to go ahead and do open expression builder, launching it again. And if I want to find out the total number of transactions for each product, I just have to do a count over the table for that product. So I'm going to search for count. And then I'll come down here and grab count any expression, just like that. And then I have to choose what column do I really want to count here. And I just want to make sure that I count a column that doesn't have null values, right? That's going to be kind of the simplest here. So I'll just grab product key because I know product key, this is not a distinct count, so it's going to count every occurrence. And I know product key does not have null values in this data set. So I'll do that. Click again on save and finish. And then we can do one more real quick test here. We can preview the data. And that's going to kind of set us up for one of the other demos I'd like to do here in just a minute. All right. So now I can see exactly my product key, exactly the total sales, and how many transactions occurred, which means we can now determine the average price per transaction. We'll do that in a derived column, and we'll do that next. Let's do it now. So how do we add additional transformations? The same way we added the first one. We come right here, we click that plus button, and from the drop-down list, I'm going to go ahead and grab the derived column transform right there, and then we're going to set this up, all right? So I'm going to create a new column here. You could also, with derived column, you can replace the value. So very common design pattern in ETL, specifically data warehousing loads, is if a column was null, if it didn't return a value in a lookup, we replace it with a hard-coded value, -1, unknown, NA, something like that, right? So you could absolutely use it in the same capacity right here in a data flow in ASA, absolutely. But what I'm going to do is something a little different. So I'm going to create a new column, and it's going to be average sales per product. So it's going to be the average per product for each transaction, right? And so that's the first part. Then I'm going to enter an expression here. This is going to be very easy, right? Because what we're going to do is we're going to say input schema. We're going to take the total sales. I'm going to divide that by total transactions. And this is going to give me the total sales divided by the number of transactions, which will give me an average. All right, and that's it. We'll do save and finish again. And then once again, I'm going to take advantage of that data preview capability, and we're going to refresh it. So we'll refresh it. We'll give that a chance to load. All right, and this gives us over here, it gives us our average sales by product. All right, so that's pretty cool. We now have that information and we leveraged a derived column to do that. We did have a question here that Matt sent me that said, can a Synapse pipeline trigger be invoked from an external app like ASP.NET and some other, in other words, can you invoke a Synapse pipeline from other apps? The answer is yes, you can, but it's not quite as intuitive or easy as it was with Data Factory. So like with Data Factory, one of my favorite examples, I actually have a YouTube video on this, is you can call a Data Factory pipeline directly from like an Azure Logic app, which if you've ever worked with Logic apps, there are over 400 connectors. You can literally trigger a Logic app from anything, from, like a record gets inserted in a database. And because of that, you could then set it up so that you essentially trigger your pipeline from anything, right? Which is pretty cool. So that's a really awesome workaround for Data Factory. But right now, today, you can't connect from Logic app. So I haven't really tried connecting from any kind of web app or anything like that to execute a pipeline. I would imagine that capability is there. I believe it is. But I know that I have struggled with even something as simple as executing it from a Logic app. So I'd have to look into that to be sure. I'm pretty sure, I think I said yes earlier, but I'm pretty sure not 100% because I just haven't tried it. Whereas with Data Factory, I worked with that for a long time, so I tried a lot of different things and had no problem with that. So I would imagine you can, but we got to look into that. All right, so let's do this. We've aggregated the data. We tried a window function. We've done derived column. I want to rank the data. Let's rank it. Let's find out what are our top selling customers, products, whatever it is. So to rank it, once again, we click right here. We're going to add a new transformation into our data flow. And I'm going to go ahead and add in the rank function. Got to keep an eye on that clock here. And we're going to give this rank a name. All right, so let's give this rank a name. I'm going to call this product rank. Product rank. So that's going to be a new column that gets added into our data flow. And then for the derived column right here, from our derived column right here, it's saying, what do you want to rank by? And I'm going to rank by total sales in descending order, right? So if you have the most sales, you're number one. Congratulations. And so now what do? We're going to do a data preview. We're going to check to see if we have the new column called product rank, and we're going to verify that it's correct. Once again, this is taking advantage of that Databricks cluster in the background that has been provisioned. And so here we go. It looks like we have a bunch of total sales. So this is the total sales, 586, 543. From high to low, this looks 100% correct. So that's great. We could take this further. It's getting close, so I'm going to transition over to Power BI. But we could keep building on this. The last thing I would say is that, if you wanted to run this data flow, what you need to do is you would go back over to a pipeline. In your pipeline, you add in the data flow activity, all right? And then you point to the data flow that you want to run, and then you run it from there. So I'd point to that data flow that we just created, and I would execute it. Now, the data flow is not done because I'm not actually going to go through that final example, but all I would have to do to finish this is just add a destination and load this somewhere. I could load it to a file, super easy to create. I could load it to a database, right? But we're not going to go through, and I didn't plan on going through that. I just wanted to walk through the different data cleansing transformations and capabilities and what that looked like compared to maybe what you're used to with other ETL tools, right? All right, so let's transition real quick and talk a little bit about Power BI. First, I'm going to go ahead and turn off, looking at the questions here, I'm going to turn off data flow debug. Doesn't look like I'll need that, so I don't want to get charged for that if I'm not using it. And then I should have, I think it's a pretty quick little PowerPoint, like one slide, and we'll skip over it. So we don't need the PowerPoint. Essentially what I wanted to talk about here is that, and we showed it at the very beginning of this workshop, Power BI integration really works in two ways, right? One, we can connect directly to our Power BI workspace from right here. And with that, we can then build new reports and we can edit existing reports. Once again, bringing that data analyst into the space, they can run those on-demand SQL queries. They can maybe even do some very basic kind of ETL that's more enterprise level with pipelines and data flows because I think it's pretty intuitive. And then on top of that, they can build their reports. And they can edit existing reports from right here in the Synapse workspace. So let me show you how that's done real quick. I'm going to go ahead and delete the data flow. And then we're going to go over to manage. So in order to connect to Power BI, the first thing you have to do is create a connection manager or create a link service. And then you have to publish the changes. So let's do that real quick. And when I click new, of course, right there at the top in bold, it says connect to Power BI, right? So we want to make sure that we connect to Power BI right there. So I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to give this Power BI a name, and I'll call this something like, Power BI. And then I'll use one that we've done in the past, like dashboard in a day. And it wants underscore. Let's fix that. It's funny because these right here have dashes. But mine can't. All right. So underscore dashboard in a day. And then from my Pragmatic Works tenant, I'm going to go ahead and just choose one of the many workspaces we have out there. And I'm going to grab dashboard in a day. And then I'm going to click create. All right. So that simply creates a connection directly to my dashboard in a day workspace that we have out there. The next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and publish. So you have to go ahead and publish this real quick. I thought I got, oh, there it is. Whoops, my bad. My fault. I slipped up. I'm going to go ahead and click publish. We could spend about an hour talking about that little error message right there. So we are not going to do that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click close. We've published it. Now watch what happens. If you go back to your Develop Hub, you're now going to see Power BI. And when you go into that workspace, you can have many, right? When you go into that workspace, you're going to see all of the Power BI data sets that exist. You're going to see I can click new right here to create a new Power BI report on that data set. I can delete them from here. You'll also notice that I can go into my Power BI reports, open them up. So I can go into, Dyad final report here. I can open it up, I can edit it, and I can change it. So this is a super quick demo, right? Super fast, but it just shows that capability for those data analysts where we're getting the data analysts, the engineers, and the scientists all involved and all engaged in this ASA workspace. And I think, from what I've seen, a lot of your more advanced users, your power users, are starting to take advantage of these enterprise features like pipelines and data flows because they're right there, right? I'm a Power BI person. I'm in here and I'm like, yeah, I need to get this data moved from over here. I don't want to just do it in my Power BI report. Is there kind of an easier way? And it's like, oh yeah, I can just copy the data right here and set that up on a schedule that runs every day. So that is pretty cool, and you can do that. So if you wanted to create, a new, let me see right here. If you want to create a new Power BI report, you can click right here. You can create a brand new report from scratch right here from your Synapse Analytics environment, which is pretty cool. Now, there's one more thing I want to show you before I dive in and open up Power BI Desktop and show you how to connect to the external table we created earlier, how to connect to the dedicated pool. And that is over here under monitoring, we can come over here and go over to our pipeline. So we've looked at monitoring quite a bit today, right? We've been bouncing back and forth. But if I come back over here, I can see all of my executions for my pipelines. And you'll notice we get this little pop-up right here that says consumption on it. That right there gives you an idea of how many data integration units were used to run that pipeline. And then you can take that. Let me look at it real quick because we're looking at it in debug mode. And so you'll see that it says, hey, your total data movement activities total was 0.033. Your total number of activity runs was 1 because we only had one activity in there. And you can take this information, you'd probably have something a little bit more robust, go to the pricing calculator, punch those numbers in, and get a really good idea of, if I ran this 1,000 times, because I was looping over, 1,000 files, what would that look like? What would my cost equate to? So this does give you some insight that, quite frankly, we did not used to have inside of either Azure Data Factory or inside of Synapse Analytics. All right, so the last thing I want to show you here, we'll start wrapping things up, is I wanted to show you the capability to connect to your Synapse Analytics workspace from Power BI and kind of take advantage of what we've been doing here. All right. So first of all, how do I connect? How do I find out the server name? Well, you got two server names when you connect to ASA. You have one for your SQL on demand and you have one for your dedicated pool. Once again, This is another huge capability of leveraging SQL on demand, because the dedicated pool might not always be running. It might be paused. But if you're accessing data and you're building reports from your data lake and you're using that serverless compute, you know that compute is always going to be up and it's going to be running, right? So I'm going to go over to Manage here. And from the Manage Hub, we can go over to our SQL pools. And I'm going to show you how you can real quick get the SQL endpoints so that you can authenticate and connect from Power BI Desktop. If I want to connect to serverless, right, I would click on built-in right here. And when I click on that, over on the right, it's going to show me right here my workspace SQL endpoint. And I can copy that out. So that is the server that I want to connect to. Now the database name, you got to remember that as well. And I think it's Serverless P1 or something like that. So I'm going to take that back over to Power BI. And I'm going to, from Power BI, I'm going to do get data. We're going to do more, right? And we're going to search for Synapse. All right. So we'll zoom back in here and I'm going to search for Synapse. And we'll grab Azure Synapse Analytics, also, previously known as SQL Data Warehouse. And that'll be the first step. And then I'm going to do connect. Now this is going to give me obviously an authentication screen. I'm going to put in the server name. And then I will type in Serverless P1 for my database name. And then I can do import or direct query. Now I believe that the table I created was taxi data and it's like 100 million rows. And I do not want to attempt to bring in 100 million rows. So I'm going to do direct query and just connect to the data directly into my data lake. All right. Now you could write a SQL statement here. But I don't want to, I haven't ever tried that actually with open row set. So I would imagine you can. I always do it through the external tables. It makes it a little bit easier and you'll see why. When I go to the next screen here and I click OK, it's going to show me a list of all of my external tables once I connect, of course. So I'm going to use my Microsoft account and let me go ahead and sign in real quick. We'll authenticate right there. All right, so I'm using obviously Azure Active Directory here, and then we will approve. All right, and then we will connect. All right, so once I connect to that server, that database, I'm gonna be able to see all of those external tables that exist right there. And there we go. There is that taxi data external table. So once again, creating that external table on top of those data lake files just makes my connectivity here so much easier. And I'm able to leverage that compute power of the serverless P1, right? So if you're doing direct query and you're taking advantage of the serverless P1, that's going to be pretty cool. All right, and so this right here is going to show me all the data. I can click at the bottom. Once I select it, we can click load. I know my face is probably in the way. We can click load right here. And then when we click load, that's going to load all of that data right here. Well, it doesn't load it because we're doing direct query, but it gives me access to that data and we can start building reports. So this is pretty cool. Very easy, very intuitive. You can connect. Now, we didn't do a Spark database today, but if we had done a Spark database and had tables that were created there from our notebooks, we could connect to those too from Power BI. So all of this is kind of integrated together. I do want to show you though, before we start wrapping things up, I want to show you we can also connect to dedicated pools, right? So that's that massive parallel processing, that dedicated pool that we've provisioned, that we can pause, we can turn it on, we can scale it up, we can scale it down, we can connect to that as well. The way I would do that, and there's actually, it's a couple years old now, but there is an incredible video out there that is on dedicated SQL pools and Power BI, and it talks about the better together story, how you can leverage key capabilities in your dedicated pool like materialized views, result set cache, and how you can leverage the key features in Power BI like aggregate tables and so on and so forth to really get just incredibly great performance in analytics. And that was out there on Data Ignite. Was it Ignite? It would take me a while to find that video at this point, but there is a really good video that talks about the better together story between those two. What I'm going to do next though is I'm going to show you where you would go. If you wanted to connect to your dedicated pool, it's actually the exact same process. The only difference is when you come over here, instead of clicking on built-in, because built-in actually says It's the same exact endpoint. The only difference is the built-in, the serverless, has this built into the server name. The dedicated does not. All right. So if you just want to copy it out, though, what you can do is you can come back over to the Manage Hub, go back into SQL Pools, click right here on Dedicated P1, right? So we click on Dedicated P1 right there. And then over here, we can copy out that workspace SQL endpoint. And now we can use that in Power BI. So now I can zoom out. Let's flip back over to Power BI. And I can tell it once again, we want to connect to Synapse. We grab Azure Synapse Analytics just like we did before. Click Connect. We put in the server name, type in my database name, dedicated P1, and then say direct query again, and then click OK. Connect again. Same exact credentials. I'm using Azure Active Directory credentials here. You could use your database credentials, right? Because remember that there is a SQL Server authentication there. So if you haven't set up Azure Active Directory, you can definitely take advantage of like the SQL Server authentication. All right, so Justin, nice to see you, Justin. Always keeping up. Justin said, what is the advantage to direct query the ASA dataset versus Azure SQL dataset? Do you mean by that Azure Data Lake? And there's like a 30-second delay here, so might not pick that up right away. If you are using the direct query to the SQL, using SQL on demand, the serverless database, you're going to be getting the obviously the compute power of the way that the serverless on-demand compute works. So that's going to give you obviously a little bit more computational power, which is a good thing. I assume that what you meant was the direct query for against using SQL on demand versus just connecting. Because the other point here, and maybe this isn't what you were talking about, but we could connect directly to our data lake from here as well, right? So I could connect directly to my data lake, directly to a folder from right here in Power BI. That works as well. But this is what I want to show you here, because probably most people know that. What I wanted to show you here is we could actually connect using the serverless compute and get that, you know, big data processing compute power without having to have dedicated P1 spun up. If that's wrong, Justin, I think you have my email, so feel free to send me an email and just clarify that question, and we'll kind of talk about that. All right. So this right here, what do we got? Internet sales. That's the table we created earlier in the class. Now I can bring that into Power BI Desktop the same way we did serverless earlier today. All right, so surprisingly, I'm actually not getting done at 2:05, which I'm very impressed with myself about, because quite frankly, I usually have way too much material, but I made sure to scale back and not go too deep into a lot of these topics. But once again, I cannot encourage you enough. We have been insanely busy this year with Azure training, Azure Synapse training, where we've been doing these private boot camps. And so we wanted to get this out there because there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of confusions around ASA. Hopefully this cleared it up. In a lot of ways, it's a lot of the same technologies you're already working with in Azure. They just work better together now, right? You got that collaborative environment, that unified development environment for all of your people. But if you want further training, you want to dive deeper into this, please reach out and contact us. We would love to do private training for you. And of course, you have that sale is available until the end of what, Sunday? Sometime on Sunday, I don't remember what time, but the sale is available for the on-demand learning as well. I'm going to hang out for a couple of minutes here. Matt, if you'll just feed me some questions. If there are some good questions there, we'll go through them. But I know it's been a long, 2 hours, 45 minutes. You guys have hung in there, so we appreciate that. I'm going to do a follow-up Q&A video in the next week. I'm on vacation next week, but I'm going to try to get it done next week anyway. So we'll try to get a follow-up. So any questions I wasn't able to get to today, or there's probably a few of them out there I got to research, because as we talked about, technology is growing at a rapid pace. I will get that Q&A video out there for you guys, and we'll kind of rehash some of this out. All right, so thank you. Matt, if you'll put, I don't have access to the chat, so if you'll put my email in there for everybody, I'd appreciate that. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and then I'm going to look at these questions over here, and let's see what we have. So, when calling Synapse from Power BI Desktop, does it count as traffic from Azure to on-prem? So no, because you're going to publish this out to the service. So that's actually a great question, right? They're actually going to communicate to one another, which means that if I'm connecting to Azure Synapse from Power BI Desktop and you publish this, you don't need a data gateway. You can set up a data gateway for more enhanced security or what have you, but when you're connecting to Azure from Power BI, once you publish it and you schedule that refresh, you do not need to set up a data gateway, which a lot of people find empowering and very freeing. All right. Erica said, is there a way to connect to Power BI to the Spark pool? I looked into this on the Power BI forums, and there's a way to connect to a table. If you create a table on your Spark pool, so if you are using your notebook and you create a database and you create a table, there's absolutely a way to do it. There's somebody in the community who I saw do this. He talked about the whole shadow table thing. Simon Wheatley, I think Advancing Analytics. He has a really good video on it. So there, I don't know which one. He has a bunch of videos, so you have to dig through them. But if I remember correctly, there is a way to do it. Yeah. Let me see. What else do we got here? Maybe I missed a couple. No, I've answered most of the ones that I've been fed. If we have big data for a dashboard, should we use Databricks versus Synapse? So that depends, right? This is a big, highly debated topic across people who have obviously been working with Databricks for a long time. Databricks has added a lot of cool and pretty awesome features in there that make their product a little bit better. If you know anything about Microsoft, though, they have a very agile approach and they update their product very fast as well. At the end of the day, they're both using Apache Spark in the background, right? So you're going to have to make that decision as an organization. If you're starting from scratch and you're using all these other Microsoft technologies and you want it all to integrate together, I would probably recommend starting obviously with Azure Synapse and using those notebooks there and using Apache Spark there. If you already have stuff that's out there in Databricks, the migration might be too much work. I don't know. I haven't tried that. So that might be a situation where you say, hey, we're already in Databricks. For those existing reports, we're going to leave them there. For the new stuff, we might do them from Synapse Analytics. Good question. All right. So I think that's a good point to kind of end the meeting today. I want to thank everybody again for joining us. I always have a great time doing this. I love doing these events. I wish I could do them every month, but we have to switch it out between different team members. Let us know. Is there a topic that you really want to hear about? Is there a topic you really want us to do that we haven't done? We have a bunch of them that are coming up. But if you have one that you think would really hit home, let us know. We would love to do that as well. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We will see you next time.